Klockan är 9, kammarens sammanträde har inletts. Vi börjar med EU-politisk debatt. Debattregler. Statsrådet inleder debatten med att redogöra för regeringens prioriteringar i EU-arbetet. Detta anförande får ta högst 15 minuter. Ledamot från det största oppositionspartiet har rätt till ett anförande på 7 minuter. Övriga har rätt till ett anförande på högst 5 minuter.
For the first speeches, we have no right of rejoinder. Then we have a second round with addresses of no more than 2 minutes. Then we have free rights of rejoinders for the members participating in the debate in the size order of the parties. And there can be no more than 4 minutes per round of rejoinders. Now we will first hear from Hans Dahlgren, Social Democratic Party.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, in the autumn of 2019, the Prime Minister read the first EU declaration ever here in the Swedish Riksdag, and since then our cooperation has really been tested. Sweden, the EU and the world are struggling against the pandemic that spreads death, illness and unemployment. But one thing is for sure, major threats like pandemics, climate crisis or terrorism cannot be solved single-handedly by one country alone. It takes cooperation, it takes systematics and it takes solidarity. Today I would like to speak more in detail about 3 areas that are of decisive importance for the EU and for Sweden. First, the path out of the pandemic, then the respect for EU's basic values, and to conclude how we in the EU can stand up better for our common interests. Mr. Speaker, let me first remind you why the European Union is so important to us, the reason why we spend time and energy on this work and this cooperation, which today may be more important than ever before, and that is because the EU gives Sweden strength, a strength that is far greater than our own. And the most important thing is that together we can ensure peace on our continent. We have established and we continue to establish strong links between us, so strong that a war between our countries is now completely unthinkable. We have the strength of cooperation in the climate transition and in the struggle for our democratic values. We get the advantages of being able to trade without obstacles on the entire European market. Yes, on each individual issue, Sweden is strengthened through this cooperation. The EU cooperation is valuable in itself, but it's also important for the peace, security and development of the entire world. And Sweden can use this great opportunity to influence that we are given by our membership. The point of departure for Sweden should be that we should fully cooperate in EU cooperation, which should be active in the shaping of all its parts in a way that safeguards Swedish interests. We get a lot at the same time as we contribute to the development of other countries in exactly the way that well-functioning cooperation should be. The priorities of Sweden for EU work have been established to create more jobs with good working conditions, to fight the climate crisis, to increase security and safety, and to pursue a migration policy that is humane, that abides by the rule of law, and that is sustainable in the long term. In the EU cooperation, Sweden has contributed to forming strong alliances. During the budget negotiations during the summer, we took a clear responsibility together with 3 other countries, and we made a difference. And thanks to early leadership, we've been able to gather a growing number of countries, both behind the European climate law and raise climate ambitions. And together with several other countries, Sweden has put forward proposals about how the single market can be developed. And all these are successes that are based in the strong positions taken by the Swedish Riksdag. The EU is a union where not only the largest actors decide. An active member country like Sweden that wants to be fully engaged in the core of the EU can also gain influence that exceeds its size. And regardless of what we discuss, we do that in the knowledge that the European Union is a cooperation that Sweden has everything to gain from. Mr. Speaker, the world finds itself in the midst of a pandemic. In country after country, the number of infected people are back at the same levels as last spring. People die, more people fall ill, and many more lose their source of income. When the coronavirus started spreading in Europe during the spring, several countries acted contrary to the principles of cooperation. Countries closed down their borders without warning, and they kept medical equipment to themselves. And we couldn't trust the free movement when it really came to the crunch. Since then, cooperation has improved. The EU countries has decided on a gigantic recovery package, and common stores for protective equipment are being built, one of them here in Sweden. And the most important thing of all, together we've managed to produce a vaccine for all the EU countries, and the first vaccinations could be carried out already after Christmas. So the focus now is to reduce the infection rate and to protect life, health and jobs. And after the pandemic, we need equally strong and intensive cooperation to build a stronger EU. This does not mean that the road forward is through further common indebtedness or to establish obstacles to trade against the rest of the world. But we cannot continue as if nothing had happened. The recovery must strengthen our preparedness in the face of coming crises of different kinds, and we need more cooperation. We need this to ensure our access to products that are necessary for our preparedness, both against pandemics and in other strategic contexts. Through a well-functioning EU, the crisis management of both Sweden and the entire Union can be improved. And we are going to do this as a part of our way to strengthen our resilience here in Europe in areas that are vital to our safety and security. But to try to safeguard strategic autonomy in certain areas must be done without EU turning inward towards itself. Our open economy serves us well, and we need to strengthen competitive power, to improve digitalization, and make sure that the EU has absolutely world-class universities. And to make this possible, we need the highest possible ambitions for industry, research and education. At the same time, we need to reduce the gaps within countries and between countries in the European Union. We need a more equal Europe, a strong Europe, with a fully developed single market that is combined with good working conditions and a high standard of living. And that's how we can build a strong EU that is prepared for the future. Mr. Speaker, the work to handle the corona crisis and to exit this period with a strong position requires that we really take the climate transition seriously. This is an existential matter for humanity as a whole. A transition is necessary in order to ensure our basic prerequisites for life and for the welfare of the future, and the EU plays an important role here, a very important role. This is something that cannot wait. We must act now, and we must get more to join us in this fight. The situation is serious, but in the work to stop climate change, there are also great opportunities if we do what it takes. Now that the countries of the world are renewing their goals and their efforts in accordance with the Paris Agreement, I am happy to note that the EU can keep its position at the forefront. I think that was very clear that when the EU a couple of weeks ago submitted our new ambitious undertaking to the UN, and now it's got to be implemented. And Sweden will work consistently to ensure that the EU does what it takes to reduce emissions drastically in time. Mr. Speaker, EU cooperation is based on some very basic values: respect for human rights, freedom and democracy, equality, equal opportunities and tolerance, justice and diversity, and an independent judiciary. Each and every one of these values are important for each person in each member country, and the compliance with them are of decisive importance for the EU, for democracy and for all of us. In several countries, there are worrying examples that the respect of these values is inadequate, where judges are kicked or appointed in an order that is not independent of the political powers, where independent research is threatened by being closed down, and the conditions of the free media are also impaired. The EU is a union for democracies. All countries must live up to the basic values that they have promised to uphold. When our values are put on the back burner, we lose confidence between countries and confidence in politics, and the EU will lose its strength. Without mutual trust, the economy will also suffer. Investments risk being stopped, trade will suffer, and the jobs will disappear. Sweden has been pushing for years to ensure that the payment of EU grants shall be conditioned with respect for the principles of the rule of law. Since the beginning of this year, there is now finally a mechanism that for the first time links EU money to our joint values. This is an historic and entirely necessary stand on the part of the EU. Mr. Speaker, the pandemic has hit hard against Europe, and at the same time, ruthless Islamist terrorists are taking the opportunity to attack. I'm thinking about the terror attack in Vienna and in Nice that took 3 lives. Every such attack in a member country is an attack on the whole of Europe, on our open Europe. Gross criminality knows no borders. It moves ruthlessly across Europe, and for that reason, the whole of the EU needs to fight crime everywhere, together. It shouldn't be possible to hide in any corner of Europe. It takes more cooperation between the police force, the prosecutors and other authorities in the EU countries to deal with crime. For example, through demands for passenger details from more means of transport, in addition to flights, it becomes easier to follow the travel of criminals. We should also work to ensure that crime-fighting authorities are given the best possible access to information and evidence. And this shows once again that it takes cooperation to solve the major changes in society: terrorism, crime and pandemics, migration and climate. Another example of the jobs. We should work for more jobs in all our member countries. Our common market offers major opportunities for enterprises, and we should invest in education, research and innovations for even better conditions. But we have to have good jobs with fair and just conditions, and workers should not be put up against other workers. And at the same time, we must not, on any condition, jeopardize the Swedish model. Mr. Speaker, last year, the UK left the European Union, and since the beginning of this year, they also left the customs union and the single market. We regret this, but it was good that we managed to agree on an agreement and a new relationship, even if it came late. This should be as broad and as deep as possible, at the same time as our bilateral cooperation with the UK must be further developed. The EU has access to several tools to handle the challenges and the threats. But I believe that our union could be an even stronger actor in international politics. It is of importance when the EU gets together and acts as one voice against violence or impose sanctions. And for that reason, it's bad every time that individual countries put a halt to the whole union being able to speak on these issues. Sweden should be involved to build a strong Europe, an EU that is engaged in international cooperation, that supports the European safety order for democracy and human rights and for the rule of law. And through the EU, Sweden will have a greater impact to contribute to peace and security in our adjacent area. Our support for the freedom-fighting population in Belarus will be stronger together with other countries. The protest against the infringements of Russia against its own citizens, the aggression against the Ukraine, and the illegal annexation of Crimea becomes more powerful because the EU does something together. In only a few hours, Joe Biden will swear the oath as the 46th President of the United States. The United States are a crucial partner for cooperation for the EU and for Sweden. And with the administration that comes into power now, we see great opportunities for deep and transatlantic cooperation on a rule-based world order, on the climate and on security and safety. The growth of China results in both opportunities and challenges. We need deepened cooperation between the EU and China in areas such as climate transition and trade. One example is the investment agreement that the EU and China have agreed on. That cooperation must be based on the EU interests and values, and with human rights among them. Mr. Speaker, we are in the midst of a pandemic with new difficulties also for the European cooperation, but I'm convinced that the European Union will manage also this test. The EU has to manage this test so that the unique project that the European Union is can grow even stronger and be a cooperation that continues to defend openness and solidarity, cooperation that makes each individual country stronger, that makes Sweden stronger, a union that works for de-escalation and a dialogue in a world with a very loud voice. Sweden should continue to be there to build that cooperation. Thank you. And a rejoinder from Jessica Rosvall from the Moderates. You have the floor.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, Europe, the world, and Sweden are in the midst of a serious crisis. There are urgent problems that we need to address here and now, and many things that we need to tackle together. One task that cannot wait is the joint effort on opening up our countries. There, the vaccine has a crucial role to play, but to achieve the wanted results, we need to have a common certificate of vaccination, not 27 different systems, one. We are pushing to make this a reality. Tomorrow, at the meeting of the European Council, that has to be an issue of priority for Sweden as well, but also during crises that reshape our society, which the corona crisis is. We need to be able to look to the future. Sweden cannot afford to stand on the sidelines as new issues emerge and need to be responded. This is particularly true for the European cooperation because big changes are underway for our joint defences, security effort, climate and the migration. Sweden has an important role to play in the development of Europe, demonstrated by previous governments. But that requires three things: a realization as to what can be done, an ability to make priorities, and strength to act. For Sweden to have an impact, we need a clear Swedish agenda. We cannot control development, but we can influence it. We can put our foot down and choose our path. A rule of thumb also for social democratic governments ought to be to only have summits when you want something to become common European policies. The Moderate Party understands how important it is to work with like-minded states to safeguard values that we share with other states. It's about democracy, the market economy, openness and the rule of law. But it also concerns the climate, free trade and the digital single market, crucial to Swedish enterprise. There are those who want a slimmed-down EU, and we will have people who want the EU to be as big as anything. But that is wrong. The EU should be relevant and do the right thing. So today, Mr. Speaker, I want to introduce the 4 cornerstones of future Swedish EU policies. There are so many more things we can achieve if we have a clear Swedish agenda. First of all, job, free trade and competitive edge. If the EU is to become a world leader, we need to jumpstart our economy. Europe will be made strong by work, entrepreneurship, research and innovation, not taxation and welfare allowances. What we need now is more trade, more single market. In the EU corporations, those who dare to be at the forefront have the most influence. When other people are hesitant about the services sector, the digital economy, 5G and free trade with the world around it, Sweden has to be bold enough to take a lead and together with like-minded EU states work to tear down the obstacles that inhibit Europe. Those who now want to see more of closed states and protectionisms come to the entirely wrong conclusions from the ongoing crisis. If they're allowed to set the agenda, we risk to beat down a path away from the one that has been so successful for Sweden and Europe, but also for the global economy. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, more of climate and environment cooperation. Sweden has a unique possibility to become a green force in Europe. We know that the EU has to be at the forefront and that we have to make sure that technological development leads the way. Member states that have the highest emissions need clear incentives and also requirements to address their emissions. Sweden has to be a driving force to ensure that all countries have a carbon dioxide tax, at the same time that we continue to develop the system of emissions trading schemes. The fact that not even the EU single-handedly can counteract climate change is no excuse to do less. No, the EU should do more, and not least demonstrates that it's possible to combine reduced reductions with economic growth. But then we need the nuclear power to do that, and we need to have a voice of unison in the climate effort, preferably together with the United States. Third of all, a common foreign policy and security policy. The crass truth is that the EU member states cannot defend Europe, and yet less our immediate areas surrounding us. Sweden has to be at the forefront to develop the projects in the defence area that has been adopted over recent years, not least within defence industries. If Sweden is able to make the EU speak in one voice on central foreign policy matters, they can make a real difference in the world around us, and Sweden can stand up for their interest with a force that we couldn't have done single-handedly. Fourthly, the rule of law, the values and principles about democracy, rule of law, free movement and openness that built Europe. Countries that water down our joint rule of law and the fundamental principles of the EU have to be challenged with the help of the new rule of law mechanism that is now about to come into place. Mr. Speaker, we live in difficult times, which is why we now need to take every opportunity we can to increase freedom and wealth, to clean up the environment around the world and in our country. Much of those answers lie in the European cooperation. So Europe is in a situation where a strong Swedish voice could be more important than any time in the past. The Moderate Party offers this exactly what we want. We know what we want both in Sweden and in Europe. Thank you. Thank you. We now pass the floor to Martin Kinnunen from the Sweden Democrats.
Mr. Speaker, 2020 was a historic year to the European Union, and I'm not saying this in any positive kind of way, and I'm also not thinking about the Brexit, which was concluded and actually was something truly historic. I'm actually talking about something else, because 2020 was the year when the EU was transformed into a debt union through the agreement of the Recovery Fund. Thousands of billions will now be borrowed, and these funds will not be repaid until a little more than 35 years. So that's probably quite a while after our political careers have been finished. The total cost for Sweden will be approximately 150 billion krona, and together with the increased Swedish ordinary membership fee, that's entails increased costs of about 11 billion krona per year. And what usually is quite an acceptable space for reform in a state budget that we parliamentarians debate every autumn, that kind of space we will now, above the addition to the money that we paid last year, we have to abstain from. This is enabled by a sort of a constitutional coup. According to the charters, the finance and tax policy are national competences, and the EU is not allowed to be indebted, but clear steps are now taken to dismantle this. The Swedish Democrats are guaranteeing that the Swedish policy will always be a voice that talk about Swedish parliamentarians to decide about taxation and state finances. Mr. Speaker, we're now talking about this fund from justice perspective, that the money should go to countries who've been harder affected by the pandemic than others. But if we look at the countries in Europe, the differences aren't very significant. differences are how they have balanced their economies, and to make them robust against crisis. Italy, for instance, will gain most from this fund, and they haven't had a balanced budget since the Second World War. Mr. Speaker, something that all politicians have discovered is how hard it is to roll back different packages, aid packages, and to lower tax is easier than raising it. Ask just Social Democrats. And new taxes are easier to introduce than to remove. It took Göran Persson decades to remove the temporary defense tax. And now the EU has agreed to take more loans and use them to give money to the least responsible countries. And the European Council wasn't even able to conclude this agreement until high representatives such as the ECB president said that the fund must become permanent. Mr. Speaker, in this we also have the need for taxation on the EU level, which are also part of the agreement that Sweden and the member states agreed to. And now the government and the other parties saying that this is a red line that must not be crossed. But that's what they said about the contribution to the fund as well. But it only took a few hours after that the prime ministers had gathered before the EU committee was called in, and we were told that it was futile to protest and demonstrate against these contribution, and everyone agreed to that except the Swedish Democrats. Mr. Speaker, I don't have much time, and there are many important issues on the EU level to talk about. And now I'd like to talk about foreign policy. When we see what's going on in Russia and the continuous talks with Turkey, I would like to say how crucial it is to have a very powerful common line against these states. We have to remove Turkey from the list of candidate countries and discontinue all types of contributions to Turkey. These resources should instead be invested in protecting the EU external border. And as regards Russia, we really need to have better sanctions, and we'd like to be inspired by the American Magnitsky legislation there. Thank you. Now the floor goes to Annika Karlsson from the Center Party.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, our community is our strength. Our European history is long and full of both conflict and war, but if there's something that has changed that image, it's the EU cooperation. When we have managed to put conflict, distrust and walls behind us, then our history has instead been about how we can reach major progress and success together. With joint forces, we've been able to make our continent improve again after 2 world wars. We have created the world's largest single market that links together 500 million people and approximately 30 million businesses. And together we've managed to link together enterprises, research and innovation, and we created a totality that grows even stronger. If we are going to take on the enormous challenge we are now facing with the pandemic that hits rock hard against Europe's countries, people and businesses, then we have to take this with us, that our community is our strength. It's through continued trading with each other that we are now strengthening our companies and we safeguard the jobs. When we go together as one force, we can move forward faster in the work to find new vaccines. The EU has already ensured Sweden's place in the queue now that the vaccine is ready to be used. My mother has already been given her first inoculation and looks forward to being able to meet and hug children, grandchildren and great-grandchildren again. The progress of the coronavirus is important food for thought. A closed Europe will never be a strong Europe. High walls between our countries will stop development, not challenges emissions or infection. What's built our continent and made it stronger throughout history is trade, cooperation and openness. It's taken us forward. If we are going to manage again to take Europe forward through the crisis, then we have to take new steps towards more free trade, openness and dialogue, to make our single market even stronger and reduce bureaucracy for our companies, and have the courage to continue to invest in research and innovation. That will make Europe stronger and inspire others to follow. It's also together that we can best meet the climate challenges. The EU can be a leading force to halt global warming, to clean our seas and waterways from plastics and pollution. And the green voice of the Centre Party makes a difference. We've been a driving force in the work to get a majority to go with us in the European Parliament to raise in the EU climate ambitions. We have raised the target for emission reductions from today's 40%, past the Commission target of 55% up to 60%. This is a victory for the green liberal force of Europe, but even more important is a victory for the climate. It can give the European Union an even clearer leadership role in global climate work, which hopefully will gain new force from a more pragmatic and cooperative voice in the White House and the US that will once again be a part of the Paris Accord. It's also important to continue the struggle against antibiotic resistance. We have been pushing to introduce more stringent rules for the prescription of antibiotics in the EU. Now we want to see a global agreement like the Paris Agreement in the climate area with binding targets about reduced use of antibiotics. We must continue the work with giving the EU an even sharper climate policy to improve the system for emission trading, to safeguard the Green Deal, and to continue working for sound and safe food in the whole of the EU. It's only together that we can create a stronger and safer Europe, to meet terrorism and organised crime that knows no boundaries, to continue to share information and strengthen police cooperation. Europe's history has shown clearly how successful we are when we cooperate, and the Centre Party will continue to be a force for a green, democratic and libertarian Europe. Because what gave us that's what gave us such strong support in the previous EU election. We need a Europe that stands up for all people's equal freedom and rights, that safeguards openness and equal opportunities. And we will continue to be a counterforce against xenophobia and populism, against leaders and forces in the EU that thinks it's possible to remove parts of people's freedom and democracy without destroying its entirety. Mr. Speaker, in times of worry and crisis, and unrest and crisis, we will be an evident voice for everything that has made EU strong historically. Free enterprise, trade, the ability to link people closer together to each other, and the strength of the liberal democracy, which is also the basis for the future of the EU. Thank you. The floor goes to the Left Party, to Ilona Satmer-Waldau.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, Europe today has been hit hard by the COVID pandemic. The number of infected individuals has increased, while the care workers are making a heroic effort to save lives. In many countries, the inhabitants have been ordered to stay indoors with the help of law enforcement, a Europe we're not accustomed to seeing. When push came to shove, the EU did not manage to stand strong together. PPE that was going to go from a warehouse or a factory to one country to another was seized, and those who ordered it went without. One effect of the pandemic is that even the EU has realized that austerity does not work. The finance policy framework has been sidestepped and limitations on subsidies are no longer in effect. But for years, the EU has developed policies for spending cuts and austerity, which has weakened our resilience against crisis. We need to have stronger public healthcare systems throughout Europe. In Sweden, we need crucial investment in our elderly care services. Skilled workers should have good abilities to perform their jobs well. The right-wing policies of the EU has created big problems through having worsened working conditions. For many years, the EU has been rigged to be a race to the bottom when it comes to wages and conditions, which creates unsafe, unsecure workplaces, which creates workplaces where infection spreads easily. For example, the German abattoirs. The employees often come from poorer EU countries to the east, and they have substandard conditions, and they lived in cramped housing. This leads to consequences. Just in one single abattoir, 1,300 people were infected last spring. As a consequence of the pandemic, Germany has now changed its law, but a pandemic should not be required for European workers to have better wages and living conditions. We need to create a working life where everybody has the financial strength to stay at home if you fall ill. It's about having strong trade unions so that important PPE is there when you need it. It's about having a living wage so you don't have to live in cramped housing. It's also about having permanent employment and security. The wage earners themselves know best what the challenges are in their industries. No politician in Stockholm or in Brussels understands this quite as well. So we need to have trade unions and employers agree that Swedish salaries should not be set by bureaucrats in Brussels. We should resolve the issues of low wages in the EU countries without posing a threat to our Swedish model. Mr. Speaker, in the wake of the pandemic, we've also seen how some states have introduced laws without time limitation that infringes on personal freedoms. Therefore, there are no guarantees that states will repeal these laws after the pandemic. One example is Hungary, where the government has been given increased powers, and people who are deemed to disseminate untruths can be sent to prison. Countries that do not live up to the principles of the rule of law have made advances during the pandemic. Starting from this year, those who are in breach of the rule of law principles can lose their EU subsidy. But Hungary and Poland have at every turn managed to push through change and managed to stall this adoption. In Parliament, they have friends who vote against all the proposals. We need to ensure that EU funds do not fall into the pockets of leaders of governments that dismantle democracy. We need to end the stalling from these states, and we need guarantees to protect fundamental human rights. Mr. Speaker, the situation for the Kurdish people in Turkey becomes increasingly untenable. At the same time that the EU continues to put billions into the country to keep refugees away from Europe and continue to pay out pre-accession support, something that legitimizes the oppressing policies of Turkey. The test drilling outside the coast of Cyprus clearly demonstrate that Turkey does not respect the EU and that the EU has its hands tied when it comes to Turkey because of the migration agreement. It's time for the EU to have a weapons embargo against Turkey. The Swedish government has to continue to be a driving force in this issue and to stop all financial aid to Turkey. They have to take responsibility and not buy their way out of it. Thank you. The floor is passed to Desiree Petrus from the Christian Democrats.
Mr. Speaker, the Christian Democrats in the last election to the European Parliament, they wanted an EU in moderation. Some issues definitely need cooperation, which are cross-border, but others are best managed on the national level. And I would like to talk about this perspective more in my speech. The corona pandemic has hit Europe hard, as regards health and economy. In the short-term perspective, we have to have more coordination and focus on vaccination. We also need to focus on Europe's financial recovery and reinforce the crisis management capability of the Union. But this crisis cannot be an excuse to just move the EU's mandates outside of the framework of the treaty. We have always been a pro-European party. We know that we need to cooperate about internal market, climate and environment, migration, fighting cross-border crime, counteract terrorism, and to work for social development in all member states. But you can show solidarity with affected people and economies without regulating salaries, demanding a quotation for the parental insurance and unemployment benefits at an EU level, proposals that are now coming on a broad front from the so-called social pillar. We warned the government and Prime Minister Stefan Löfven in 2017 when he invited the EU state and heads of states to accept the social pillar. We saw the risks with the new directives that would override national competences. Today, the government really should be self-critical because we can now see that we have to fight to make sure that the EU will not make a legislation proposal as regards minimum salaries and to be introduced, which would be a risk to our entire model for the labour market. Mr. Speaker, the government doesn't have the capability to fight for Swedish values. Even the social democratic ally largest union, LO, are criticizing the government for not doing enough to stop the EU Commission's proposed directive about minimum salaries. Many unions in Sweden, the Swedish business and the Swedish municipalities and regions, as well as the employment agency, wrote an open letter to the government and saying that they have been acting too cautious and passive. Mr. Speaker, at the end of December, the EU member states managed to agree on the long-term budget, recovery package, and a deal with Great Britain. It was important to get this in place before the new year. But if you analyze the EU long-term budget and the Corona package, EU has now struck a new road. The recovery package consists of enormous loan and aid package, and therefore they will now try to get in new taxes and fees. And the Finance Committee of the Riksdag has been clear and said that they don't want to see any EU-level taxes. And the government also has to be very clear on this point in their EU contacts. But here we can see that the government is very passive. Mr. Speaker, it's very important that these funds that will now be paid out as loans and aids to other EU countries, that they are controlled in a good way. And if the EU cooperation will be able to stay together, it's important that all member states adhere to the principles of the state of law. Unfortunately, the government has been very passive in the EU cooperation, and the government is reacting too late and in not a clear enough way about the important values for Sweden. And here the government must change the strategy and be more proactive and active for the best of Sweden. Thank you. Thank you. And now I give the floor to Tina Acketoft from the Liberal Party.
No man is an island, complete in himself. Every person is a part of the whole. Mr. Speaker, it's almost classical black humor when you consider that this often quoted poem was written by an Englishman, the Member of Parliament, the priest and the poet John Donne. For while the inside, then no one is whole in himself, has obviously been lost among the Brits who argued for Brexit. and which after many and long turns also got a Brexit, then that's part of the reason why Liberals always advocate cooperation instead of isolation and internationalism instead of nationalism. Mr. Speaker, COVID-19 results in problems that we've never seen before for the globalized economy of our time, and it took far too long before the EU seriously spent the time and attention on the pandemic that is required by the crisis. After the EU started acting, the Union has introduced forceful and coordinated efforts to facilitate the crisis management, including economic support measures. But the pandemic also showed that many countries reacted by closing their borders, turning themselves inwards. And the coming years mean that the EU has to be at the forefront in order to turn the EU outwards, to improve the climate policy and to improve competitive power. Crisis can be turned to opportunities if we learn and change. For that reason, it's crucial that Sweden now stands up for and give priority within the EU to the European Green Deal, the Commission's plan to make the EU climate neutral no later than 2050, and transform the EU both to a green climate neutral union at the same time as we have economic growth and welfare. This will mean major changes to a number of sectors, both at EU level and nationally, and will also mean that we as national parliaments must realise that more issues have to be handled at EU level if we take a green future seriously. There is no alternative for those who believe in facts and science. Liberals are happy that the EU now has more stringent climate target. This means that we now take nuclear power seriously and give it the same opportunities as other forms of fuel. The discussion about what the EU is and should be is important, and perhaps the most important part of this is our values, because what are we if we don't have a common backbone? Together, we need to show clearly that the EU is a union of values, where it's obvious that member states that have promised to follow the Copenhagen criteria but don't do it suffer the consequences, and that our values do not come to an end at the EU borders, that we don't abandon the Eastern Partnership and those who fight for democracy in Belarus and the Ukraine, that we are clear in our condemnation of Putin's Russia, where they have once again arrested Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader, simply because he is the opposition leader, Alexei Navalny. That we see and show solidarity with our neighbouring countries to the south, also when it comes to the distribution of vaccine against COVID-19, and that people who flee are given legal opportunities and possibilities to enter the EU safely and securely. Mr. Speaker, in order for Sweden to contribute to this EU and to be the liberal voice that I and many other people share, you don't have to be a liberal to be liberal. We need to be a wholehearted partner in the EU cooperation, a part of the EU core. But to get there, we risk losing influence in the Union by being outside of the Eurozone, the banking union, and the EU prosecution authority. If Sweden also, that means that Sweden is left outside crucial parts of the cooperation. When the Swedish government, in addition to all this, chose a frugal line in the budget negotiation, we confirmed Sweden's standpoint once again as being tepid towards the European Union. This is not good enough. We know more and we want more. Thank you.
Amanda Palmstierna, Miljöpartiet. Varsågod.
Thank you. The floor goes to Amanda Palmstierna from the Green Party.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, 2 weeks ago, the capital was stormed. there was a state of emergency in Washington. What has been happening in the United States lately seems like it comes from a drama show on Netflix or HBO, but this is now reality being described in the media. But why do I start by talking about the United States in an EU debate? Well, the point is we cannot take our democracy for granted, not in the United States, not in the EU, not in Sweden. We need to fight for democracy every day, globally, in Sweden, and in the EU. Democracy is the foundation for a functioning society, and Sweden has for a long time been a strong voice for the principles of the rule of law and democracy and human rights in the EU, in Sweden, in the world. At the end of last year, the rules were made more strict when it comes to the rule of law, which means that countries that engage in corruption, that don't respect free courts, freedom of speech and freedom of the press should not receive EU aid. Well, this means that states such as Poland and Hungary cannot protect each other anymore because by placing a veto to make this mechanism come into action. The government has been a strong voice to push for this with strong support from the parties represented in Parliament. More people than ever are fleeing. Today, there are very few opportunities for refugees to enter the EU legally and safely. Instead of being able to seek asylum from their home countries, they are forced to flee via unsafe routes and they fall into the hands of human smugglers. Many refugees drown in the Mediterranean on their way to Europe. The fact that the EU cooperates with despots to prevent refugees from reaching Europe is doubly wrong and a completely untenable situation. It is important for Europe to take their responsibility and reach political unity on this issue. The right to asylum has to be respected. We need to have assessments with legal certainty. People shouldn't have to risk their lives to live a life of safety and freedom. The foundation for the European Union is freedom, democracy, respect for the rule of law and the human rights. We need to defend this. Over the autumn, the UN reported that the world is heading towards several degrees global warming. The consequences are disastrous. There was a landslide on the 30th of December in the Norwegian municipality of Gjerdrum, about 30 kilometers away from Oslo. More than 30 homes collapsed and several people died. The reason for this was heavy rainfall. When the ground becomes so wet that it becomes unstable, well, a landslide might be a fact. Climate change will bring with them more rain, heavier skyfalls, with more increased risk of landslides and flooding. It's completely crucial that the EU becomes a leader on climate throughout the world. The story of the EU started with 6 European countries starting to cooperate on the production of coal and steel. Now, instead, the EU aims to become the world's first fossil-free continent to produce steel without coal. The most important tool to reduce the climate footprint is the emissions trading scheme. This is very important because it means that there is a cost involved for power plants and industries to emit carbon dioxide. Under the leadership of Isabella Lövin, Sweden launched something that came to be known as the Swedish proposal. This reform means that surpluses of emission allowances, these are cancelled instead of piling up, which means that the prices of emissions allowances has skyrocketed, and now we can see the results. The fossil fuels become increasingly unprofitable, and now coal is dramatically dropping around Europe. The day before yesterday, we think it is extremely important for Sweden to continue to enhance the system for emissions trading. And we also want the Green Deal to be implemented to a high degree. Finally, as we look back on this year, we can see an EU that has been tested by Corona, by Brexit, but the EU has also grown more mature, learned lessons, and we can see a cooperation that has really matured, and it has demonstrated that the EU is the way forward. Thank you. Thank you. That concludes the first round of addresses, and now we go to the second round. And first out, Hans Dahlgren from the Social Democratic Party.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, the speeches that we've just heard show, I think, that we have strong unity about major parts of Swedish EU policy. I welcome that. And as the Minister for the EU, I'd like to thank you all for good cooperation, not least in the EU committee. This makes it easier to develop Swedish EU policy and what we prioritise in our cooperation, which is particularly valuable for the coming presidency, which we will have in less than 2 years. I hope that with time we will also have greater consensus on the social issues. The government that I represent sees it as self-evident that we should strengthen the position of wage earners by having fairer working conditions, that people should have equal opportunities when it comes to access to the labour market, that children should have the right to childcare and schools, and that people should have a dignified life. But that can't just apply to Sweden. In order to have sustainable EU cooperation, we need to have fewer differences in Europe, not bigger gaps. If more people can live off their wages and more people share the responsibility for homes and families, that would make the EU better. But to want better conditions for Sweden and for the EU, it doesn't necessarily mean that this has to be decided by Brussels through EU-wide legislation. But it could mean that we have common targets by comparing with each other, by using benchmarking and using recommendations to strengthen welfare and to reduce the gaps and to keep Europe together. And I hope that as many as possible will share that ambition with the government. Thank you. Thank you. Jessica Rosvall from the Moderates, Jimmy Kimnanen from the Sweden Democrats, Ilona Satmarivaldu from the Left Party and the Centre Party, and have requested rejoinders. Jessica Rosvall, you have the floor.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The vaccine is a light in the darkness. But if we are going to manage the first mass vaccination in the history of the EU, we need strong leadership, both in Sweden and the EU. And it's not enough that people are inoculated. We also need a common vaccination certificate so that we can open up our continent as rapidly and as safely as possible. That is important. Now Sweden has to join the forces that push for such a vaccination certificate. Others can't do the job for us. So I'd like to ask the EU minister, will Sweden on Thursday give priority to the issue of developing a common vaccination certificate? And if you answer yes, when do you think that we will have such a certificate? Mr. Dahlgren, you have the floor. Thank you. Thank you for the issue, for the question. I can tell you that as late as possible, we have notification from the Commission that dealt with a number of issues concerning vaccination in Europe, and one of the questions was that of a vaccination certificate, where we said we need a joint EU effort that would ensure that we get a good and reliable way of certifying that people have actually been inoculated. We are all in favour of that recommendation, and we hope that we will develop criteria for a common vaccination certificate in Europe as quickly as possible, but I can't tell you exactly when. Thank you, Ms. Rosvall. Thank you, and thank you, Minister. As I said, this is incredibly important for the recovery of Europe, and it's been said that many countries will have this as a demand, that you can show a certificate, and then it's necessary that you can be able to trust a certificate. The EU Sweden now has to take on a leadership role to push for this issue together with our Nordic neighbouring countries. The Greek, the Portuguese, and the Portuguese prime ministers, and the Danish and Finnish governments are in the process of developing such a vaccine passport. I don't think it's enough to say that, yes, we're all in favour of this, but I want to know what you were doing in order to push for a Scandinavian line here. Yes, I can tell you what the government is doing. We are participating in the European cooperation to develop such a certificate. We have a Swedish representative in the Commission's committee. We are probably one of the countries that has the greatest experience of vaccine work, and I think we can contribute a great deal to this work in the future. However, this is not entirely uncomplicated, because no one knows for sure whether the fact that you've been vaccinated, are you then free from infecting others? So this is what we need to find out, but that doesn't stop us from working on the vaccination certificate as rapidly as possible. Thank you. That brings us to the end of that round of rejoinders and replies, and the floor now goes to Martin Kinnunen. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 15th of December, the Commission presented the Digital Service Act for the regulation of the Internet and the large tech platforms in particular. The Sweden Democrats welcome this. Such rules can contribute to creating common rules and a common playing field. We want to see the focus on the content. Illegal content should decide what's allowed or not. And this, it's also important that there is a right to appeal. I'm asking now the government how you look at this attempt at regulation, and how do you want to ensure that the demands for removing illegal content does not mean that more voices are silenced on the internet? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to this proposal for a regulation on digital services, we welcome this. It's a question of putting stronger demands of responsibility on those who are responsible for the platforms, so that illegal content will be removed. Like the Commission, we believe that the platform companies should take greater responsibility to remove illegal content, and the Council is now negotiating about this. Thank you, Minister. Well, the reply from the Minister is something that we can agree with. This is what we see as basic information infrastructure, with which means that if you are excluded from an opinion platform, you may have problems when it comes to operating a business, because these tech platforms nowadays, they operate things like libraries and others, and they can stop the competition. What is a bit concerning, I think, when I read the document that the government has developed before, where they have said what I interpret as them saying that they welcome that the platforms will remove material, that they should move ahead or move beforehand. And I see that as a threat also to legitimate voices on the internet. The Minister, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't see that as a problem, that these companies should act before the Authorities Act. We've had examples before of child pornography being removed, where the tech companies have moved independently before the authorities, and I think that's been absolutely correct. Thank you. That brings us to the end of that round of rejoinders and replies, and the floor now goes to the Centre Party, to Annika Karlsson. Mr. Minister, without order, that's the only word I can use to describe the actions around the social pillar in the summit, at the summit in 2017. And we now have proposal. The European Commission has put forward a strong proposal for a directive about minimum wages, and the Commission now refers to the social pillar. In the Riksdag, there is strong unity that we should not have legislation concerning the social pillar, but nothing has been done by the Swedish government to stop this proposal, unlike the Danish government. The parties on the Swedish labour market have requested that the government should use all means at their disposal. So I'm asking the minister, do we have to trust Denmark, or do you intend to do something properly and really act against this? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have no problems getting my act together, and I can tell you that as late as the day before yesterday, during the at the meeting for Common Affairs, I brought this up. But it's not true that this proposal for minimum wages resulted from the summit meeting in Gothenburg in 2017. It's been discussed for a long time in the Council, and there have been proposals from several member countries for many years. But there is nothing in the 20 principles, the so-called social pillars, that says that we are going to legislate at EU level about minimum wages. On the contrary, it states here that all wage formations should be according to national practice and with respect for the independence of the parties on the labour market. And when we do this, we're not doing this with passiveness, but we work as actively as we can. And primarily, it's because we want to stop the proposal for minimum wages, and secondly, to ensure that it's never implemented in Sweden. Mr. Speaker, well, that the government says one thing in Sweden and another thing in Brussels is what has made the parties react and publish an open letter just before Christmas. And we get reports from many different directions about how Sweden acts. If there are reports of feeble action on the part of the Swedish government, I get suspicious, because there was a great difference between the parties when it came to what route to take in 2017. So my question now is there a problem for you to have to go against the first thing that comes up when the Commission refers to the social pillar when they propose the directive? Or is it because the Commission has published this proposal now that you refrain from saying something which is expected by all the parties on the labour market? Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't know what reports you have access to, Annika Karlsson, that says that we speak with a different voice in Brussels than we do in Sweden. We don't go to Brussels an awful lot nowadays, but we have digital meetings. The meeting the day before yesterday was digital. We should have been in Brussels, but I would have said the same thing in Brussels as I said at the digital meeting, which all the other EU ministers could hear loud and clear. We are not going to have an order in the EU that means that we cannot decide wages in the normal Swedish manner, although we are members of the EU. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. That brings us to the end of that round of rejoinders and replies, and the floor goes to Ilma Satmari Waldau from the Left Party. You have the floor.
Mr. Speaker, the aid organisation Oxfam recently presented a report that demonstrates how Sweden, together with countries that can be considered tax havens, block important measures to be taken to stop international tax evasion. The government has planned for companies to have to report on the size of their profits and the taxes they pay in different countries, a public list that would aid this effort to combat tax evasions. The Social Democrats, who claim to be against this, have in government voted against proposals that would combat tax evasions and avoided pushing for stricter rules, measures that can bring us increased resources for our welfare systems. My question for Mr. Dahlgren is, why does the government prioritise big corporations before openness and transparency, and why do you block important measures to be taken to stop international tax evasion? Hans Dahlgren. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With every respect, I think you've asked the question in an incorrect way. We do not prioritise big corporations. We have some very clear points of departure when we talk about international taxation. The first is that we don't want taxation rights in Brussels. We oppose everything that can be construed as meaning that the European Union would start taking EU-level taxation decisions. We oppose that. The other aspect is that we do a lot of our international efforts on the OECD level, and that's where we think the measures should be taken. So we think that about all countries, not just the European countries, can be combated in this way. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, in a public country-by-country report, Sweden has a vital role to play to stop. They played an important role in stopping rules to make corporations report on taxation paid in different countries. That would combat tax evasions and make companies less prone to have aggressive tax planning. In the last voting, Sweden voted against this proposal together with Ireland, Malta and other tax havens, and the proposal was stopped with just one vote. In 2018, several parties promised to take action against tax evasions, amongst them the Social Democratic Party. Now it's come to show that it's only the Left Party that consistently has followed through on their promise to the voters. So why does the Social Democrats fail the voters with the promises they made to them? This is about public taxation policies. Yeah. Hans Dahlgren. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to repeat our principles on these issues, and of course they are still valid. I cannot see how the Social Democratic Party has betrayed their promise to the voters. We never try to promote or make tax evasion easier. On the contrary, we can see how the joint financing of our welfare systems and all public activities in Sweden, of course, this is an evident point of departure for this task. And this is also true for what we do in the European Union. So I would strongly refute that we've betrayed our promise to the voters. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. That concludes that exchange of rejoinders. Now we have a rejoinder from Desiree Petrus from the Christian Democratic Party.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, the Social Democrats say that the social pillar with the 20 items to it doesn't raise demands for directives or anything. Well, the only problem is that, for example, Portugal, that has the presidency, they've said that they really want to put their foot down, and the EU Commission is also pushing to turning several proposals into directives. And that is the problem here. And when even the LO organization in Sweden says that the government has been passive, that should at least lead to the government to stop and think about what else could be done. And now we have several proposals, quotas on the boards of directors to increase gender equality. We are pro-gender equality, but we have a government that have said no to this, and we've also seen more transparency on salaries, to have public reporting on salaries. That goes against our traditions as well. What is the position of the government and Mr. Dahlgren to this? Thank you, Mr. Dahlgren. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, we heed what the Confederacy of Trade Unions say. I spoke to them no later than yesterday on this topic, in fact. And what I can inform you is that part of the government's strategy to work with a minimum wage issue, which is, of course, a strategy we have. Of course, we try to remove this from the agenda. We have now been listened to, that there will be a legality review if this is binding, if there is a legal ground for this kind of directive. If that is the conclusion, then we need to have a directive that does not affect how we set wages in Sweden. And I think it is in the item 3, section 3 in the first article that countries who have collective agreements should not fall under the scope of the requirement to introduce legislation on minimum wages. And we need to have that exemption as legally strong as possible. And we will ensure this. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the Committee on the Labour Market, we have spoken to Mr. Nordmark and pushed for this issue, and we've also brought onto the agenda that to try to stop this proposal by mobilising many member states to want to stop the proposal. That should be the first point of action, which Mr. Dahlgren does not say. And the other thing would be to wait the report on the legal points and then to minimise the damage this could cause. But now we have another proposal for a health union, and this does cause us to feel concerned. That I know that Mr. Dahlgren has said that we have a domestic competency on healthcare issues, but we could have the same thing happen here to see directives in the healthcare area, and we have a pharmaceutical industry that has a very large turnover every year, that we need to safeguard this industry. So, Mr. Dahlgren, what are the risks that more of these initiatives will go towards the federalist way? Thank you, Mr. Dahlgren. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do not see this as an imminent risk. I can see this discussion on the health union not as a sign that they want to have changes made to the treaty to have a different distribution than we have today. And health issues are domestic issues, but we need to coordinate these issues on an EU level as well. The discussion we had here before about certificates on vaccinations, that's a typical example of the type of thing we need to coordinate on an EU level. And when it comes to producing a vaccine at all together with joint efforts, that's also a good example of working together on an EU level. That's how we should proceed with this. Then, of course, I think, first of all, we should try to stop this proposal with other allies. And no later than yesterday, I was speaking to a colleague from an Eastern European country that was not part of the more sceptical group, but can now join our forces. Thank you. Thank you. That concludes that round of rejoinders. Now we have a rejoinder from Ms. Aketoft from the Liberal Party. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will read from this text that EU competence on the matters is limited to legal services, and the Council has been asked to deliver another opinion. Another quote: the EU does not have the competence to set either a level or a procedure for minimum wages. Mr. Dahlgren asked where Annika Karlsson got her reports that proves that Sweden has a softer line in Brussels compared to the line they demonstrate here when we talk about the requirements for minimum wages. That this issue has already been mentioned by several of my colleagues in here. Yesterday we could read in the papers the government is lame before the threat of the European model. This was introduced in a paper, a local paper. So, Mr. Dahlgren, how do you view the statement made by the president of the LO Confederacy? Mr. Dahlgren. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can tell you that the Minister for the Labour Markets had a meeting, a digital meeting, with the chairman of the LO and the representatives of the other parties, the social partners, the day before Christmas Eve, and we explained our view on this. We don't have our hands back tied here to take action. Our representatives, our Prime Minister, have a very strong trade union past. There are no representatives who would take measures that mean that we have our hands tied behind our backs, that we do not speak out enough to object against different proposals. That is actually not true, what's being asserted here. Ms. Aketoft, thank you, Mr. Speaker. One quote was from the Swedish representation and the other one was from the Austrian representation that do not agree with legislation on minimum wages, and that's why I mentioned both of them. The EU minister and I, we do share the view on EU-wide welfare, and I think that Mr. Dahlgren will agree with me on this, that we need to invest in welfare for all. We need the social pillar. We need social care. If we can all, as citizens, feel that the EU brings added value. Just because we see beggars outside of our stores today doesn't mean that Romania has also, just because we can't see the beggars today doesn't mean that Romania has now taken responsibility for all their citizens. They've just closed their borders. So thank you, Mr. Dahlgren, that you've stated clearly that Sweden is a strong voice to retain our right to decide on wage setting in Sweden, but also to be a strong force to promote social justice for all EU citizens. Final answer from Mr. Dahlgren. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can just concur with Ms. Aketov that you can do both things at the same time. Thank you. That concludes the round of rejoinders to the address from Mr. Dahlgren. We go back to the list of speakers. We now have an address from Jessica Roswell from the Moderate Party.
Herr talman,
Mr. Speaker, in my opening address, I underscored how important it is for the Swedish government to make priorities that are in the Swedish interest. They might sound trivial, but unfortunately it is not. Yes, well, we have a government that manages to make priorities of issues that go against Swedish interests. Of course, I'm referring to the social pillar. As the Prime Minister and the government were very much part of producing and preparing, and even had a summit in Gothenburg 2017 to celebrate the adoption of the pillar. Exactly what the Moderate Party warned you about happened. The EU is now motivating numerous proposals and initiatives with the principles of the social pillar. Instead of making priorities of reforms that could lead to future progress in the EU, Sweden now has to invest a lot of time and energy and political capital in trying to counteract and stop proposals that threaten the Swedish model. That could not have been what the government wanted to see. And now also we receive alerts that the Swedish government is running a defensive and weak line in negotiations on minimum wages, in contrary to what Parliament wants and in contrary with what the Social Democratic Party promised the Swedish people. Sweden deserves a better government, a government that has a clear idea about what to use the European cooperation for, a government that, based on that, does their best to place agendas on the items on the EU agenda, questions that Sweden wants to make reality. We have rejoinders to this address from Hans Dahlgren, Social Democratic Party, Jessica Roswell, Moderate Party, Martin Kinnunen, Sweden Democrat, Annika Karlsson, the Centre Party, Ilona Sasmarvella, Left Party, Desiree Kedrius, the Christian Democratic Party, and Tina Aketov from the Liberal Party, and Amanda Patios from the Environmental Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to maintain that it's important that the EU don't only talk about financial issues, but also social. And I'm not alone in this. The other day, I found a text that had been signed by the former Moderate Party leader and Prime Minister, that the EU must work to promote social justice and protection, gender equality, solidarity between generations, and protecting the child's rights. The EU shall do this. So my question to Jessica Roswell is, because her and her party friends, why are you now so against that the EU is committed into the social issues when it was so self-evident for Fredrik Reinfeldt before? Jessica Rosfeldt? Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the problem with the social pillar is what we warned you against. This was not just an exchange of experiences. It has become something else. That's the problem. I'm not against cooperating about welfare issues and to make sure that everyone has such a good standard that we do in Sweden. But the social pillar clearly shows that this is not the right way to go. And I also find that the development that we can see today during the Portuguese presidency, that they are now prioritizing this issue. I think it would have been good if the Mr. Minister could here agree that what happened in Gothenburg in 2017 was wrong. And in the previous replies, he said, I would like to add a word when we discuss the minimum wage. I think it's quite vague. I think the government is very vague in these discussions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, no, I don't agree with this either. I don't think that we are vague in any way. I think we've been very clear when we're talking to our colleagues surrounding Europe and also in the different committees and when we've talked to the social parties. I don't think that this is a fair description, that we would be vague or passive. But we can just see that we have different points of view here. And what we saw from the meeting in Gothenburg, that we shouldn't have done that. I think that's the opposite. I think this is exactly the things that we should be working for. This is a part of the treaty, the EU treaty. We have all agreed to work on these issues. And of course, we have to do this in a right way. And if we see any wrong proposals, of course, we will counteract them. And then we do that and we cooperate with the governments and the parties in the Riksdag. Jessica Rosvald, final rejoinder. Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. While doing it in the right way, I think that's by increasing the economic welfare and to cooperate to make sure that we have freedom and rights for all European citizens. I don't think that social democratic government will ever acknowledge that this was the wrong way going about the social pillar instead of focusing on the right issues. I didn't expect that, but I really would like to tell you, Mr. Minister, that now when the Portuguese presidency is focusing on the social pillar, I really hope that the government now has a strategy to counteract some of the proposals that will be introduced, which will undermine the Swedish model. Thank you. That was the end of that rejoinder. And now we give the floor to Martin Kinnunen from the Swedish Democrats.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have great unity in the chamber when the perspective of the taxes in EU, and we welcome the clarity from the moderate party and the criticism against the Corona Fund. But there were only two parties who wanted to vote down the budget, this reform proposal and the taxes. So the question is, where is the line for the moderate party? Why weren't they able to say no to this? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for the question. Well, the Moderate Party have already been very critical of many parts of the EU budget. That is about the fund and the size of the fund and the EU taxes. And we have talked about this the whole time, and we have had quite a broad majority for this. We are not very happy with the agreement that was made, but we were not prepared to abandon this agreement and then put the EU into a deep financial crisis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, and thank you for your reply. Well, I think it's our job here in the chamber to make sure that we steer the EU cooperation along the right line. If we always think that the government has to be responsible for their part and we can't interfere, then I think this will create a strange situation. I think that Sweden would have been able to stop the writing on EU taxes. This was not something that were to be introduced. If we'd been very clear here from the beginning that we will not accept these writings, then I think that they might have been removed, and then we could have had something else added instead, and then we could have improved the Swedish line a bit. Thank you. That was a final rejoinder for Jessica Rosvald. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also think that we could have negotiated much better when it comes to the writings about the taxes. And I have been very clear with that. I don't think that government was very good at this. We didn't see any changes here going in the right direction. Our final decision in the EU committee was not in consideration of the government or in support of the government. It was just that we were not willing to be the only party to stand in the way for this agreement and to cause a deep financial crisis for the EU. Thank you. That was the final rejoinder. And now we have give the floor to the left party, Ilona. Satsmari Valda. Mr. Speaker, the agricultural policy is about 40% of the total budget in the EU, and now the agriculture also stands for 40% of the total emissions. And the agricultural policy is not in line with the research that in order to make the agriculture sustainable, they will continue to use chemicals. We can also see that the member states cannot introduce stricter environmental laws and so on. Well, the moderate parties have never been known to be a green party, but they have criticized the aid package for the agriculture. Why can't the moderate party criticize and be critical of the EU environmental policy instead of the agriculture? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't agree that we're not a green party. We truly believe that Sweden has to be very strong in the leadership for the climate policy and the climate work, and we've been very clear, and we put forward proposals along this line. I would like to pose this question and as regards when the social pillar, and I'd like to ask the left party. The left party greenlighted the social pillar after the summit in 2017. Now, when you've heard the discussion that's going on today when it comes to the minimum wages and the threats to the Swedish model, are you now regretting supporting the social pillar? Mr. Speaker, I would like to stick to my subject, which is about the agricultural policy and the aid to the agriculture policy. There are many positive parts. 30% will be earmarked for environmental changes, but one right thing doesn't correct the other wrong things. 80% of the payments go to 20% of the largest agricultural companies and landowners. This agriculture aid undermines democracy and makes it possible for Poland and Hungary to be corrupt, where large parts of these funds actually go to ministers and other people who are great landowners. Moderate party is always for the principle of the state of law, but when it comes to the agricultural fund, the moderate party doesn't seem to care that much. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I regret that I didn't get an answer to my question, but when it comes to the agricultural policy, the CAP in the EU, we've been critical of this, to move funds and aids from one pillar to the other. Now we have to look forward to make sure that we update this cap as much as possible. I think we have many safeguarding mechanisms in place, and the European Parliament managed to agree on this because the heads of state and government actually made this policy worse before. But I hope that these new mechanisms will secure these. Well, this was the final rejoinder there, and now we give the floor to Amanda Palmstierna from the Green Party.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker. Right. Thank you for your first speech. I'd like to address something that you brought up there. The moderates are keen supporters of free trade, and I also read in your party program that you think it's important with human rights and it should be respected at all levels in society, both in Sweden and internationally. And we from the Green Party then believe that we look at both these issues at the same time. This year, the EU Commission will put forward a legislative proposal that the UN principles of human rights should become law. And when this has been dealt with in the Employment Committee, the moderates have said no. So I like to ask you why you don't want to see this as guideline legislation in the EU. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not in the Employment Committee, so I have to be a bit careful when I answer your question. Let me put it this way. Just as Amanda Palmstierna says, cooperation is very important to the moderates, and one of the reasons why is because we believe in free trade, free competition, and the EU community that creates jobs and welfare. We don't believe in closed societies and protectionism, and human rights are an important part of this. So I'd like to expand on this a little bit. I also said that the European Union should speak with one voice, and that we could have qualified majority on foreign policy issues and address those issues in that way. Thank you, Amanda Palmstierna. Thank you for the answer. The EU debate is a broad debate, so I have full respect for the fact that not everything can be addressed exactly. But let me put it to you that such legislation is very important. And the Commission made a survey, and many companies are positive to such legislation. And the reason is that we should have a level playing field, and we shouldn't be able to compete by infringing on human rights. And the reason for that is that in 2020 there was still child labour and wages that you cannot support yourself on. And this, so the conclusion of that is that it would be very good if Sweden could stand up for such legislation. Jessica Rotsvall. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank Amanda Palmstierna for that message. Yes, I agree that it's important that we support free trade. It's important that we have more free trade agreements. We mustn't go towards a closed and protectionist world. But I'd like to send a message to you as well in the Green Party. In this transition, which I also addressed in my speech, a part of this transition is that we also include that nuclear power should be a necessary part of the transition. Thank you. That brings us to the end of that round of rejoinders and all the rounds based on Jessica Rotsvall's speech. I now give the floor to Martin Kinnunen from the Sweden Democrats for a second speech. Mr. Speaker, the environment and climate issues will continue to be at the top of the European agenda during 2021. The promises within the framework of the Paris Agreement will be updated, and decisions will be taken on the Green Deal and perhaps the most current issue, the taxonomy. The EU has an important role to play when it comes to fighting environmental problems. The single market means that our countries are interwoven, and we Sweden Democrats also welcome regulation at EU level, but in their eagerness to control in detail, according to the principle one size fits all, many things go terribly wrong. We have the sea and water policy, where the so-called visa judgment at EU level have meant that we have problems upgrading our water plants, and small impairment of water quality in one part can trump out something that is considered by other assessors to be preferable. We have the taxonomy, where we have pushed for change. Nationally, we have succeeded. The Riksdag forced the government as the only country to vote no in the European Council, but the decision went through with qualified majority. The idea between taxonomy is basically good. The financial sector wants better information about sustainable investment, but the countries have different conditions. In Poland, it may be a good idea for the climate to invest in gas and abandon coal-fired plants, which it's not in Sweden. In certain countries, we shouldn't cut down more wood, but in Sweden, we have the possibility of doing that. We must also be careful not to fulfill the EU's dream of becoming a coal sink. And the independence when it comes to forestry policy has never been more threatened. And it's important that Sweden points this out in all contexts. Thank you. Hans Dahlgren has requested the floor for a rejoinder along with Jessica Rosvall, Annika Karlsson, Elena Satmari-Valdu and Desiree Petrus. Mr. Speaker, I could begin by agreeing with Martin Kinnunen's request that Sweden should protest against the way in which the EU, through the taxonomy regulation, threatens Swedish forestry. We need a completely different point of departure there, and Sweden has pointed that out. But I would also like to point out, to address something else. I think many will sigh with relief in a few hours when Joe Biden has been installed. But there is one party who would have liked to see Trump continue to rule in the White House for another 4 years. So I'd like to ask Martin Kinnunen if what Jimmy Åkesson said, that the Sweden Democrats share the view of EU cooperation that President Trump has said, that it would be worse to get rid of the multilateral cooperation in many different areas, that we would be better off on our own. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Hans Dahlgren, for your question. The Sweden Democrats have always been clear that we support free trade. We like the idea of being able to trade with our European partners. In this way, we do not share the view of the Trump administration when it comes to trade barriers, etc. There are clear distinguishing lines here. But we do sympathize with the policy that means that you are tough on crime, less migration, and no to destructive identity policies. But that is a discussion that is separate from the collapses that the Trump administration have managed to impose during the past 4 years. But we will continue to be against free migration, destructive identity politics, and more of our own politics. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, says Hans Dahlgren. I still wonder if this embracing of the policies of the Trump administration also applies to areas like international cooperation, multinational cooperation, and a belief that we should continue, that you will continue to support those policies. I think it's pretty amazing that the party colleagues of Martin Kinnunen still nominated Donald Trump to the Nobel Peace Prize and says that the administration has been successful from a foreign policy point of view. If you think that if that includes President Trump's view of the European Union, please let me know. Martin Kinnunen. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I suppose I understand that it's an exciting discussion to delve into the policies of the Trump administration, but we have our own policy. We believe that it's important to have positive trade relations within Europe and with the United States, but we are not positive to the trade barriers introduced by the Trump administration. We could also say that Trump made terrible mistakes when it comes to what happened after the election in the US. But the US have been successful in the peace negotiations in the Middle East, where there are better relations between Israel and many Middle Eastern countries today. But as a party, we have not been engaged in nominating President Trump to the Nobel Peace Prize. That's individual party members. That brings us to the end of that round on rejoinders, and the next speaker is Jessica Rosvall from the Moderates.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Even if the Sweden Democrats are no longer pushing for Sweden to leave the EU, there are issues that the party opposes on the EU level. amongst them the migration policies, because the basic principle for freedom of movement, for that to work or exist, you need to have joint migration policies. Today there are huge flaws and deficiencies when it comes to the member states' compliance with the rules and regulations in place now. This concerns the unfair numbers of people received by different countries and an unfair number of people coming to Sweden. So what is your opinion when it comes to harmonization of legislation on migration policies? Mr. Kinnunen. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To start with, I welcome the change of course from the moderate party on the migration policies. We had a problem in Sweden for many years where the two biggest parties who have spoken in favour of mass immigration to Sweden, and that is no longer the case, and that's good. It's also good that you are clearer in your criticism of your the joint proposals on migration policies. We think that it's important for the states to remain independent in this area, because that's the only way we can ensure that we have responsible migration policies for Sweden. But it is important to cooperate on the EU level. We need to secure Sweden's borders. We need to have an exchange of information between states so that all countries can perform better in this area. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Roosevelt. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Kinnunen. That is why I'm asking the question, because I don't quite understand this. The EU-level cooperation should continue, so perhaps this is a minor issue, but to have a situation where the member states have migration policies that the EU countries have decided on together, there are proposals that the European Support Office for Asylum Issues in Asia should be enhanced to ensure that the member states jointly actually comply and act in accordance with the laws adopted and harmonized. But that is a proposal that the Sweden Democrats have objected to. So can you go into some more detail on that? Thank you. Final rejoinder, Martin Kinnunen. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What's basic for the Sweden Democrats is that we should use the EU to work together on migration issues, but each country needs to have its own rules. In Sweden, we shouldn't have any net immigration into Sweden. We've had irresponsible migration policies for decades. We are bulking under the strain. Of course, we cannot accept EU policies that force us to accept immigration. We need to demand a different system. Sweden has to safeguard its own interests. We need zero-level immigration right now. Thank you. Thank you. That is the end of that round of rejoinders. And now we have a rejoinder from Ms. Karlsson from the Centre Party.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, the foundation for EU cooperation is based on democracy, human rights, and the principles of rule of law. In the budget effort, there have been proposals prepared talking about a padlock on democracy to prevent the union, to actually stop countries, to make it difficult for countries that don't comply with those fundamental principles. So before Christmas, this proposal was adopted. Before we had the Article 7 procedure. At present, we've seen Poland and Hungary move in a wrong direction, and we've had several Article 7 procedures that require unanimity, and they've been able to assist each other in preventing measures being taken. But now we have a stronger safeguard mechanism for democracy. The Sweden Democrats were not in favor of the adoption of this democracy mechanism. Why not? Thank you, Mr. Kinnunen. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If we describe the current situation, we have a compromise, an agreement now that all countries are in favor of. And the Sweden Democrats welcome this. And we also welcome that we have a perspective with a higher degree of legal certainty when it comes to the rule of law principles, because the basis for this is the language we can see in the treaties and the text therein. And of course, we think it's been worded well, but to transfer this into clear guidelines for countries how to shape their policies, that's not an easy task. It's not the case that traditions of different countries, how you appoint judges, these things are dramatically different. And it's a problem, a challenge for the EU to explain to voters in Poland and Hungary and in Sweden what do we deem to be legally certain and not. So we don't really want to point our fingers at other countries and how they deal with their judiciaries. Thank you. Ms. Carlson. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What's interesting about this is that the Sweden Democrats have not been a constructive force to ensure we have a good solution to this. They have now, after the fact, passively said, well, maybe it's not so bad anyway. So it's about the possibilities of a country to safeguard its democracy, to respect the equal worth of all individuals and the rule of law, to not scare and intimidate those who dissent, to have freedom of the press, to have women's right to decide over their own bodies. This is something that the Sweden Democrats do not want to take up positions on. It's a bit difficult. I just find it highly remarkable. I find it very remarkable. And it's sad, I think, that you cannot stand up and defend the equal worth of all individuals and to enhance this effort in the budget level on the EU. Mr. Kinnunen. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Sweden Democrats do defend the legislation we have in Sweden on abortion. We don't think we should have European abortion policies. We think that's an issue that each country can decide for themselves. To transfer this issue to an EU level would all of a sudden mean that we would need to act in accordance with the abortion policies of other countries. And we know that our policies are quite different from most countries. We have more liberal rules on legislation than other countries. And when it comes to being constructive, that is not really something that has been a signifying mark of the Centre Party on this issue when it comes to the principles of the rule of law and the budget. The only interest you've had and what you're completely obsessed with is to try to attack the governments of Poland and Hungary. I would like to ask you to interest yourselves a little bit more in Swedish citizens and taxpayers and what happens with their money. Because, yes, thank you.
Ilona.
Thank you. Ilona Satsmaruvaldu from the Left Party has asked for a rejoinder. Please take the floor.
Herr talman.
Mr. Speaker, I will continue down the path. When we discussed the principles of rule of law on the EU board this summer, all parties, apart from the Sweden Democrats, wanted Sweden to push for this. Even if Mr. Kinnunen and the Sweden Democrats did not object to it, they tried to, in different ways, downplay the need for the EU to introduce rules for compliance with the rule of law. In the European Parliament, the Sweden Democrats have consistently voted against the adoption of rules to safeguard the rule of law. Now we can also see how Sweden Democrats discuss different theories about stolen elections in the United States and express favorable opinions about Mr. Orban. And they've engaged in saying that the storming of the Capitol in Washington was a scandal election. It was Mr. Biden's fault. So I would like to ask you, Mr. Kinnunen, do you feel that Hungary meets the requirements of rule of law? Thank you, Mr. Kinnunen.
The focus.
The Sweden Democratic main focus when it comes to the EU budget is to keep our focus on the Swedish taxpayers. In Sweden, the whole of the EU pay 100 billion euros to Poland, Hungary, when it comes to aid being given for cohesive policies. It's insane to send so much money to these countries. The Sweden Democrats is the only party that wants to stop all of this aid. We want to take the 100 billion euros away from Poland and Hungary. Why does the Left Party not push for this issue to remove all this aid paid from Swedish taxpayers to Poland and Hungary right now? Because I don't think they should be given a single krona to finance their infrastructure policies. They can do that themselves. Thank you, Ms. Waldau. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can establish that Mr. Kinnunen did not answer the question if the Sweden Democrats feel that Hungary is compliant with the rule of law and its principles. The fact is, I've never heard a Sweden Democrat ever criticize Hungary. Instead, they voice their support in different ways. When members from the Foreign Affairs Committee, for example, met with representatives from a discussion, one Sweden Democrat started by saying that they were Hungary's only friend, in difference with the other parties in the room. And let me just say, I'm a big friend of Hungary, where my father was born, and that is the very reason I can question and criticize their politics. They've introduced LGBTQ-free zones, banning abortions, political interference with the courts and judiciary. So there are many examples of things done wrong. But the Sweden Democrats do not speak on these issues. Thank you. Final rejoinder from Mr. Kinnunen.
Talman, jag förklarar.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just explained that I want to remove 100 billion euro from Poland and Hungary and their budgets. That's quite a strong attack. I don't think that those countries would consider that proposal particularly friendly. It's not our role to here in Sweden to decide what's legal and not in Poland and Hungary. In our situation here in Sweden, the court's judges are appointed by a system of representatives. It's not our part. It's not our thing here to question how they appoint their judges and what's happened in the USA and so on. That's completely irrelevant. What we want to achieve is to have the best possible conditions for the Swedish taxpayers, that we don't have to pay for building underground trains in Eastern Europe, for instance. Thank you. That was the end of that round. And now the next rejoinder goes to Desiree Petrus from the Christian Democrats. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, it's not been quite clear how the Sweden Democrats view the principle of rule of law during this year that we've been discussing this package. From the Christian Democratic side, we see that there is a great threat against the basic values and common values in the EU. And I'm very happy that the party leader of the EPP, the Christian Democratic group in the European Parliament, has been very clear that Hungary and Poland must fall into line when it comes to the requirements for independent media and an independent rule of law. When Martin Kinnunen says that we need to be cautious to question how other countries organize their legal systems, do you then mean that we should not have a common norm for independent legal systems in the EU? Thank you. Martin Kinnunen, please. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Definitely think that we should discuss this. We're now discussing the Article 7 procedures and so on. I think it would be interesting to see how we can make this clear, to see if you're in the EU, what kind of legal system should you have, so that it's clear for all the voters and the citizens in the different countries, because people in Germany, in France and Poland, of course, cast their votes for the government that they want to see. But then if we sit here in the Swedish Riksdag and say, no, those voters voted wrong, we don't like their legal systems, I don't think we can do that. I think we have to be a bit humble and not question the legal process in those countries. Thank you. Desiree Petrus. Mr. Speaker, I think this is quite a cause of concern, what Martin Kinnunen is saying, because when you enter into EU membership, you have to follow the joint values. Otherwise, you can't be a member of the EU. And then to try to undermine these values when it comes to independent media and a safe legal system, of course, then EU has to react. So I think that's quite surprising and concerning, this remark from the Sweden Democrats. Then I'd also like to talk about another thing, the joint foreign and security policy. The EU has taken a step forward since the US has been quite weak over the past years in this transatlantic link. What do the Sweden Democrats think about this, that we're now taking new measures to increase and reinforce the foreign and security policy? Thank you. Well, the Sweden Democrats always welcome a better cooperation in the EU questions, and especially the foreign and security policy, but we don't think it's a good idea to take away the veto. We do not want to see any less national sovereignty here. And when it comes to the principle of rule of law, it's the same, that the regulations that we have here in Sweden, if we're try to interfere with other countries' legal systems, maybe other countries then can interfere with our system. We don't have a constitutional court here in Sweden. Well, if Poland took away theirs, then I don't think that the EU should decide what type of courts we should have. Thank you. Thank you. That was the end of that round of rejoinders and all rejoinders on Martin Kinnunen's presentation. And now we give the floor to Annika Karlsson from the Centre Party.
Talman.
Mr. Speaker, a greener, freer and more democratic Europe, that was the target the Centre Party introduced to the voters in the EU election last year. And this was a vision that many shared, and we did our best EU election ever. We are working every day to reach this target. This is the only way that we can make Europe and the world go forward, by understanding that the climate changes don't take a break during the pandemic, and that we have to be more who do more for the climate every day. Thanks to the Centre Party and other green liberal powers, the EU take many important steps forward here. We are reinforcing the emission requirements for new cars, and to reduce the emissions from the European transport. We're banning a row of single-use plastic, and this is welcome when our oceans are filled by more than 150 million tons of plastic. We're also reinforcing the demands for reduction of emissions in total in Europe. But we're also safeguarding a free democratic Europe, and take a clear position against the powers who are trying to limiting the right to abortion, to take away the power for the women over their own bodies, for their own lives, who threaten journalists and prosecute opposition, who dismantle the openness and suffocate freedom. One of our most important election promises to have a democratic lock on the EU budget has now become reality. We will now be able to stop leaders who can't sign off on democracy and the principles of rule of law from having EU funds. Mr. Speaker, a greener, free and more democratic Europe will become a role model for more, and this is a way we can move ahead to a greener, free and more democratic world. Thank you very much. Now, Ilona Zatsmanova-Waldau and Amanda Palmstierna would like to, they rejoined us. And we give the floor now to Ilona Zatsmanova-Waldau from the Left Party.
Tack så mycket.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Annika Karlsson, in her previous address, she spoke forcefully against the proposal for minimum wages, and I'm happy that we are a majority in Sweden that are against the EU deciding on Swedish wage policy. And I hope you are also in favor of the Swedish model and of defending the Swedish model, where the parties decide themselves and where politicians don't make decisions about minimum wages and other things. Thank you. Annika Karlsson, the Centre Party, you have the floor. Thank you, Ilona Zatsmanova-Waldau, for that question. Well, in that respect, we are in agreement with you when it comes to the proposal from the Commission. If we go back a number of years in time, we already then had concerns about this type of legislative proposals would be introduced if the social pillar would be opened up. At that time, we didn't have the same analysis. We didn't share our respective opinions, but we had different opinions about whether to say yes or no to the social pillar. We saw the risks already then. We would have liked for Sweden not to take the initiative, but there were different standpoints at the time. So the history behind why there is such a proposal now, well, that's where we stand on different legs. But yes, we do agree that we believe that the EU shouldn't do this. Thank you. Ilona Satmarivaldo. Well, thank you for your answer. That leads me to the next question. What is the difference between the politicians in Brussels and the politicians in Stockholm? Here in Stockholm, the Centre Party has intervened in the negotiations between the parties and threatened with legislation if the parties don't do what the party wants. As late as in November, the Centre Party said threatened the trade unions and parties with legislation. So what is the difference between Brussels politicians and Stockholm politicians when it comes to legislation about wages? Thank you. Thank you very much. Very interesting question. If you look at different areas of competence, we find that the EU has no competence to get involved in labour market issues. That's a national competence. And when we look at the different parts that apply to the labour market, we know that we need greater mobility and greater security for workers to educate themselves further or to change their job if this is needed, because this is a national competence, and that's the big difference. Thank you. That was the end of that round of rejoinders, and the next question goes to Amanda Palmstierna from the Green Party. You have the floor. Madam Speaker, Annika Karlsson, thank you for your address. I'd like to bring up the fact that you say that the Centre Party has a green voice, and that's really necessary in the EU. And I'd like to compliment you on your work with the antibiotic issue. But when it comes to a life free from poison and toxins, and for clean water, then there's a different issue. The Centre Party made sure that that Sweden changed its footing when it comes to the water issue, and that you joined up with less favourable forces. Then we also have the question of lead, and now all of a sudden you're in favour of shotguns that use lead bullets. Well, thank you very much, Annika Palmstierna, for those questions. Well, on all issues when it comes to politics, you have to make compromises. It's on the one hand and on the other hand. When it comes to water, we see that we can reach the right effect in different ways, and that's what was included in that way. When it comes to shotgun bullets, it's very interesting that we in Sweden has very strong legislation. It's regulated in detail what you can and what you cannot use. In the proposals that were up for adoption, there wouldn't be many square meters in Sweden where you could use this type of ammunition at all. And in the long run, perhaps we should get rid of this altogether, but then we have to find an alternative, and we don't have such an alternative now, and that's why we agreed to this. Thank you, Amanda Palmstierna. You have the floor again. Madam Speaker and Annika Karlsson, thank you for your answer. It's true that it's on the one hand and on the other hand. And in that respect, you could say that the Green Party always emphasizes the environment. And we believe that the environment has been more important than people being able to hunt. And I think it's been very unfortunate because the Centre Party has been pursuing toxin-free policy for many years, and suddenly you change your mind after efforts from the lobbyists. And I think Sweden's confidence will be harmed in the long run. And when it comes to the water issue, we would have we feared that if this had become reality, we would have let in lobbyist organizations in a way that we wouldn't have liked at all. Thank you. For a final reply, Annika Karlsson. Well, Madam Speaker, you mustn't believe there is only one way to reach your objective on these issues. There are many issues where the Green Party and the Centre Party agree about the goal, but not on the way there. And these two issues are examples of that. There are better ways to look after the forests, to look after biodiversity and to get forest owners to take care of the forests they own. If you want to use bans, then the consequences will be very different. So in many respects, we share the goals, but not the way there. Thank you. That brings us to the end of the round of rejoinders with Annika Karlsson, and the next presentation is to be held by Ilona Satmari-Waldau. You have the floor. Madam Speaker, we need to make enormous public investments to manage climate transition. We need to rebuild our entire society. We have to invest massively in sustainable infrastructure and better housing. We want to see investments in jobs and reduced emissions, and we demand that the climate transition will be fair so that those who emit the most also pay the most. We and our progressive colleagues in the European Parliament, together with the environmental movement, work hard to improve and raise the climate targets and to introduce binding demands and restrictions. We expected that the Social Democrats and the Environment and the Green Party would take their responsibility, but the government's action when it comes to the new climate legislation became a disappointment. This is a step in the right direction, but the target is set far too low. The Left Party believes that the ambition for the reduction in greenhouse emissions should be 70% by the year 2050. The Swedish government pushed for 55% at least in one context and 60% with a view to more in another context, and then we back to 55%. But then in the end, the Swedish government had to agree to 55%. This is exactly what the Left Party warned against. Namely, that if the Swedish government has different targets in different contexts, then we won't be taken seriously. Now, we would now like to see the government go for 60% and more in the coming negotiations. We won't be happy with this. The climate cannot wait. Thank you. Hans Dahlgren from the Social Democrats, Jessica Rosfeldt from the Moderates, Annika Karlsson from the Centre Party, Desiree Petrus from the Christian Democrats, and Amanda Palmstierna from the Green Party have requested a rejoinder. The first speaker is Hans Dahlgren. Well, thank you. It was interesting to hear how Ilona Satmari-Waldau pointed out how important it is that Sweden, the EU makes serious efforts here. What makes it difficult to take you serious is that you are still EU skeptics. It says in your party program that you want to leave the European Union, even if you don't want to do it just now. So it seems a bit odd when you joined forces with Boris Johnson, who seems to believe that you get more power when you leave the European cooperation. So I'm asking, is it still the view of the Left Party that Sweden should leave the European Union, or are you prepared to change that?
Tack, talmannen.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Minister, for the question. Mr. Dahlgren, you've read our party program and you know what it says. What our party program says is, of course, what we abide by, but we have a proposal for a revised party program with new language on the EU, irrespective of what our Congress decides regarding us wanting membership in the EU or not, we will remain critical of the EU as a party because that is the best way to achieve change in the EU. We have to be critical to get anywhere. Thank you very much. Mr. Dahlgren, please go ahead. Thank you, Madam Speaker. So let's see what happens in the future and let's see if the Left Party changes their standpoint, because it has been slightly odd, I have to say, that specifically in Sweden, it is the Left Party that is against the EU, because throughout Europe there is more consensus on the EU and European integration amongst left parties. So it becomes strange to see in Sweden that the Left Party has most in common with the Sweden Democrats on these issues. Is that really what you want? Thank you. Ms. Waldau, final response. Thank you, Madam Speaker. We cannot be held responsible for the policies of other parties. We can only be responsible for our politics. We are critical of the EU as a party, and then sometimes we share those opinions with other parties that are also critical of the EU. I think we often take stances that are closer, more closely aligned with the government than the other EU critical parties, and I will leave it at that. Thank you very much. That closes that round of rejoinders. The next rejoinder comes from Ms. Roswell from the Moderate Party.
Ursäkta, fru talman. Fru talman.
Madam Speaker, I want to start by concurring with your criticism of the government. The Left Party no longer wants Sweden to leave the EU actively, and I think it's very good for Sweden. We welcome this. But I have to ask, what are you in favor of? Because if the EU votes on free trade, you vote against free trade. Doesn't matter if it's Canada or Japan. Even when it comes to the poorest countries in the world, when we take a vote on security policies, having joint policies on this, you vote no. And also when we voted on combating terrorism, you voted no. You even voted no to the EU budget. So my question for Ms. Waldau is, what is it that the Left Party is in favor of on the EU level? Thank you, Ms. Waldau, the Left Party. Well, Madam Speaker, it becomes very difficult to answer Ms. Roswell's question because it contains inaccuracies. We did not vote against working against terrorism together. We said yes to this. However, just like the Moderate Party, we wanted to do this in a different way. We wanted to enhance the effort. We said that we cannot just work on the basis of Islamic terrorism. It can also be domestic terrorism that is identified as posing a very big threat in Sweden and in Europe. And we also suggested that you cannot just tackle the problems once they manifest themselves. We have to work proactively to stop young people from being attracted to terrorism. And it's difficult to answer a question when it starts off on the basis of an inaccurate statement. Thank you, Ms. Roswell. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, okay, if I listen to what you said now and before, I think the Left Party is saying that the point of the EU cooperation is to be a critical voice. I don't believe that. I think you have to collaborate to achieve unison and consensus and cohesive policies. To just vote against and have dissenting opinions, as the Left Party has done, I don't think that's the path to success. So my question is, going forward, what issues and policies do you support? What will you vote in favor of? As a member of the Moderate Party, I think Sweden should be an active leader in the EU. But what does the Left Party want to vote in favor of? Ms. Waldau from the Left Party, please go ahead. Yes, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, it does become slightly odd that when the Left Party has a different opinion, because we want to achieve more, we want to set higher ambitions with our climate effort, we want to criticize Poland and Hungary democracy problems, infringement on abortion rights, then it becomes a negative thing when we want to achieve more. We can achieve so much on the climate, for example, if we join forces and tackle it together. But we also have big problems in the EU. For example, the policies that lead to keeping poor countries poor. We want to tackle this in a solidaric way. So we say no to things that are against democracy and the climate, then that's positive, not negative. Thank you very much. That's the end of that round of rejoinders. And the next rejoinder comes from Ms. Carlson from the Centre Party. And after this round of rejoinders, we have 2 additional rounds of rejoinders.
Bra. Talman.
Madam Speaker, the Left Party no longer claim to be against the EU. In their election platform, they said that we should not shift more power to the super state project that the EU has turned into, in their opinion. But they suggest all these taxes, different types of taxation, and they are in favor of the social pillar, where they introduce proposals that put into law European minimum wages. How do you think that the power of Brussels is reduced if you can have joint taxation and impact the Swedish labour market? Thank you very much. A response from the Left Party. Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Left Party, like I said, we think that we have to work in solidarity in the EU. We don't want any taxation on an EU level. If we have fees on an EU level, we want those fees to go back to the member states. We do not want to be part of creating a stronger economy for the EU in that sense. And we think that each country knows best on certain issues. The social pillar is positive to us. There are many good aspects to the social pillar. We know that we have huge social problems and differences between poorer countries to the east and richer countries to the west. Well, we need to bridge this gap. And we need to agree within the EU, how do we bridge this gap? But from that point to introducing proposed legislation that will make the situation worse for some countries, that's something we will never do. Response from Ms. Carlson, the Centre Party. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, yes, to a certain degree, you have clarified the complications, the problematic aspects of no longer being critical or wanting to leave the EU. But still, you continue to advocate a number of proposals that contradict the role you want to take on in this effort. And I can't quite make ends meet here. You say that you don't want the EU to get more, but at the same time, the EU should be able to levy different taxes, even if the money should go back to the member states. And if we want a social Europe to bridge the gaps in equality between different countries, well, that's something that is included as an aspect in the budget and in other regards. But what you have agreed to is the opportunity referred to by the Commission where different proposed legislation is put on the table, and that just doesn't match the picture Ms. Waldo is trying to paint. Final response from Ms. Waldo. Thank you, Madam Speaker. We have been clear on saying that the Left Party has never agreed to any taxation on an EU level. We remain as critical of this as most other parties represented in the Swedish Riksdag. We are still critical of the EU as a party, and the Left Party will continue to seek ways of either leaving the EU, or if we are going to work in the direction of remaining in the EU and having an impact in that way, that is something that our Congress will decide. But to me, it is very clear that now that we are members, it doesn't matter what we think about our membership, we need to do the best we can with it. We can't just stand on the sidelines saying that, oh, we don't want to be part of this, so we won't participate in the decision. So we have to be very clear in saying this is what we want to achieve. And when we are a member, we need to do the best we can with our membership. And I think the Left Party is doing that specifically. Thank you. That concludes that round of rejoinders. The next rejoinder comes from Desiree Petrus from the Christian Democrats.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would like to talk about the issue of Cuba. Socialist parties around the world are helping or talking about Cuba and spreading a fake image of this country. But since 2017, no progress has been made by Cuba as regards human rights and other civil rights. And Sweden and the EU are continuing to help the regime in Cuba, and something we oppose. A review from the civil rights defender shows that 70 human rights defenders that they've talked to say that the situation on Cuba has deteriorated since the agreement came into force. What do the Left Party think about this agreement with Cuba, and do you see any benefits from this? Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, to me, it's as important with democracy and human rights in Cuba as in Hungary, in Cuba as in Poland, and Cuba as in any other country. Democracy and human rights are the most important issues for the Left Party. Thank you, Desiree Petrus. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, since the development is not going the right way, the Left Party around here are continuing to arrange meetings with the regime's groups. In December, the Left Party organized a meeting with an organization in Malmö from Cuba. What do you think about this, Ilona Valdo? And this is the final rejoinder. Yes, Madam Speaker, I can't talk about what the different organizations or sister organizations of the Left Party do and the meetings they arrange with others. I think that you could arrange a meeting where you're also critical. You can have a meeting with an organization and be critical of it. Just because you have a meeting with them, you don't have to agree with everything that they think or their agenda. I think it's important that you have a dialogue with your opponents and your friends as well. Thank you. That was the end of that round of rejoinders, and the next speaker will be Amanda Palmstierna from the Green Party. Madam Speaker, Ilona Marie Valdo, I would like to thank you for your speech. The climate targets was something that you talked about, 5% to 5%, 60%, and so on. I don't think it's a secret that the Green Party wants to go in line with the research, because you can't really negotiate with the research or the laws of nature. But I'd like to talk about something that the Left Party has said, that the Left Party can't be responsible for other parties' policies. And I think this is interesting. Sweden made sure that the targets were raised significantly, but unfortunately we couldn't go even further. But then the Green Party is now making sure that we're doing things, concrete things that actually do something. And in the European Parliament, the Green Party is really working with the green issues. Do you just want to be happy with nice words, or do you want to actually do something? Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you for the question. For the Left Party, of course, it's really important that we do something. And that's why we're also criticizing the government when they are now trying to negotiate and have different targets and different negotiations, because then it's very difficult to get a result, and that will weaken our Swedish voice in the world. I thought actually that we were very clear. We would at least 55%, but preferably in line with science. And that was not unclear. And we took responsibility for the EU project to move ahead and to make sure that Europe is the first fossil-free continent, and Sweden is important, and the EU is a driving force in the world. We talk about the Brussels effect. I also like to talk about the emission rise, where Sweden really did a great thing with the Swedish proposal. They have actually scrapped 50 times Swedish total emissions, and it's the greatest climate effort that Sweden has done on a global level. Thank you. And now the final rejoinder from Ilona. Yes, Madam Speaker. Sweden is a driving force in the green issues, and the Green Party and the Left Party is really working hard to make sure that this is true. But when you choose different targets, when the Prime Minister in one meeting says 55% is good, and then the Environmental Minister says 60%, different meeting, that's what we want. That's not clear. That doesn't create credibility. If you want to get ahead and get anywhere in the EU cooperation, you have to be clear. And that's the Left Party is very clear. We want to have at least a 70% decrease of the emissions by 2030. We really hope that this will not be a bad compromise, that we will adhere to the 60% at least. Thank you. That concludes that round of rejoinders. And now we give the floor to Desiree Petrus from the Christian Democrats. Madam Speaker, at the end of last year, the EU Commission introduced a proposal of a health union, and it's good that the EU is addressing health issues. But it can't just be another field where we hand over the decision power to the EU in decisions regarding the health union. As regards the pharmaceutical strategy, the government has to safeguard Swedish pharmaceutical industry, which is a great part of our export industry, to a value of more than 105 billion krona. But most importantly now, we have to speed up the vaccine distribution in the EU. We have to leave this pandemic as soon as possible. Another great challenge ahead of us is how to solve the migration challenge, and the Prime Minister has often referred to solutions on EU level. And the government's standpoint has proposed general and vaguely formulated, and that's not good enough. The Christian Democrats welcomes the raised levels of ambition in the EU regarding the climate. We have to show that we can unite the reduced CO2 emissions with economic growth. This is something that we have been discussing. There have been different levels, 55%, 60%, and so on. Another important issue that is now discussed on EU level is taxonomy and climate investments. We see risks that our forestry and our natural resources as water power will not be seen as non-sustainable. And nuclear power is also discussed here. Nuclear and water power stands for 80% of our electric power supply, and the government has to act here. But the government doesn't have a strategy to be proactive. We always have to try to chase the government to address Swedish interests. Madam Speaker, we can't have this passive government in the EU level. We need to have change. Now we have Hans Dahlgren, Jessica Roosevelt, Amanda Palmstierna, who have asked for the floor. And now we give the floor to Hans Dahlgren first. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I must say that I really admire Desiree Petrus' eagerness in calling the government passive. But I would like to say that we are very active in all these areas that Mrs. Petrus addressed. Of course, we're safeguarding the Swedish pharmaceutical industry, and we're also talking about taxonomy and what that means for Swedish forestry and energy, that we have a proposal that is unacceptable to Sweden. We are very active here, and we're also active in the social pillar. And what Desiree Petrus previously said, that the summit in 2017 in Gothenburg, which has enabled the Commission to put this proposal forward. No, this is what has made it possible for the Commission to propose this, the EU treaty. And thank you, Madam Speaker. Yes, of course, we're behind the treaty. But what we say that the social pillar is that was just a starting point for putting forward new directives that we didn't want to. And I'm sure that Hans Dahlgren can see this. This is a driving force in the new presidency. The Portuguese presidency have said that they will push for minimum wages when it comes to the budget. It was the Dutch Mark Rutgersen who's made sure that we have great rebates. The pharmaceutical industry, I will also try to make the EU committee to make the government really take position to see that this is a national competency. And the social area, we are for social development. But there are a lot of things that are already regulated on the EU level about how to safeguard the employees' rights. And that's what we should continue with. Then Hans Dahlgren again. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, yes, this is quite well known that our view on this work on the social area, and we think it's good. We think it's good that the Portuguese presidency will have a summit in Porto in May, and that we will have good practices, best practices, and comparisons and so on. But I have refuted that to say that it was Mark Rutte who organized the Swedish rebate in that summer. I actually know what happened, and I've talked to people who were in all of these negotiations, that if anyone worked in this group who was respected for their negotiation skills and to be this talked about being more cautious, it was the Swedish Prime Minister. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I really hope that what Hans Dahlgren says is true and that we're driving this. But I can really see that many of our protocols from the EU committee, that the Christian Democrats and the Moderate Party, we're really making sure that the government has better points of view before they go to the EU meetings. And this is something that we've seen during your time as government. You're too passive, you don't get ahead, and not even the LO Confederacy feels safe that the Swedish Social Democratic and Red-Green government is really working to stop the proposal for minimum wages. Well, then, of course, that's cause for concern.
Då var replikskiftet avslut.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of this round of rejoinders, and the next rejoinder is by Ilona Satmarivalda from the Left Party. You have the floor. Madam Speaker, women's right to decide about their own bodies is now being attacked in several EU countries, in particular in Poland. When the EU Parliament recently criticized Poland, whose courts have banned abortion, the Christian Democrats voted in favor of this. This is welcome. But one of the members said that she voted yes because the resolution was mainly about the governing party in Poland politicizing the judiciary, not because they want to ban abortion. She also believes that it's correct to have the same policy as President Trump about abortion. So my question to Desiree Petrus now is, what is your opinion about abortion rights in the Christian Democrats? Desiree Petrus, Christian Democrats. Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for the recognition that we have taken many good decisions on abortion rights. I'm the chair of the Riksdag committee that deals with such matters, and we often send letters to countries that have bad legislation in the pipeline, which we believed was the case for Poland. That does mean that we think that the EU should take decisions on abortion rights, and that also applies to the health issues that I brought up before. What is EU competence and what is a national competence? And we are very clear on the fact that this is not an EU competence. However, we should try to influence and have the question of equal opportunities on the agenda in the EU and the right to legal and safe abortions. That's something we stand up for both in international cooperation and in the alliance government. Thank you, Ilona Sapmarivaldu. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you for the answer. It's good that the Christian Democrats want to push for the right for legal and safe abortions. My own party has been fundraising for organizations that champion the rights of Polish women for free abortion. We've seen that there's been an increase in the number of illegal abortions and that only very few people can have legal abortion, which makes this a class issue because you have to pay to get a proper abortion. So I'm asking, are the Christian Democrats also prepared to support the organizations that fight for this in Poland? Or can you envisage making it easier for women to come here to have safe abortions and support the motion put forward by the Left Party on that subject? Yes, I can remember when Göran Hägglund was Minister for Social Affairs, and he said that it should be possible for Polish women to come to Sweden to have abortions. It hasn't been on the cards now. But yes, when non-Swedish women come to Sweden, they should be able to have abortions here if it's not possible in their home countries. The Christian Democrats have been open when it comes to this. And the other day, I recorded a video to Joe Biden where I said that I hope that the US will change its views. Now, when it comes to maternity care and abortion rights and the work to prevent the need for abortions. Thank you. That was the end of that round of rejoinders, and Amanda Palmstierna from the Green Party has the floor now. Madam Speaker. Desiree Petrus, thank you for your address. And not surprisingly, I'd like to ask a question about the climate. In your EU policy programme, you say that the climate issue is of decisive importance for the future of humanity and important from an international perspective, and we agree with you on that. This year, the EU Commission will present a proposal on climate fees, and the purpose is to level the playing field so that countries outside the EU should not be able to compete with EU companies by destroying the environment. You, as Christian Democrats, should welcome this, both from a climate and from an international perspective. But I have heard the Christian Democrats say several times that you don't want this. So I'm asking you, do you want to take responsibility for the climate seriously, or don't you? Thank you. And Desiree Petrus, you have the floor. It's a bit difficult because Amanda Palmstierna brings up a number of issues that have been dealt with at EU level, but that have not been topical here in our national parliament. But we see the climate issue as a very important matter. We support the management idea, namely that we've been given an earth to manage and to take care of, and it's important that we provide coming generations with a good living environment. But then exactly how we will deal with the issue of fees, well, that remains to be seen. We are very negative towards taxes and fees, as you know, so I'm not sure what our standpoint will be there. Thank you, Amanda Palmstierna. Well, the reason I'm bringing this up now is because it was included in the budget negotiations that we had last summer. It was included in the agreement and the formulations then, and all parties here in the room were highly committed to this last summer. So really, I think we've talked about this, we have discussed this, and we've come to a conclusion. I think it's important not to completely abandon this idea about climate fees. Our colleagues in the Chamber of Commerce have looked at this and said it's possible to do this in compliance with the WTO regulations, and that is important in order to have a level playing field to push industry, and even Joe Biden is looking at similar proposals. So I think this is an important way forward. Thank you. Desiree Petrus, you have the floor. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Now I understand more what you are talking about, what we call climate tariffs, namely that others who bring products into the EU should have equal conditions, and we shouldn't be able to compete using environmental requirements for that. And we are in favor of taking a close look at the Commission proposal when they give us more concrete proposals. But it's important to have competition neutrality vis-à-vis other countries than the EU countries. And I think a strong environmental regulations would be the best tool in order to have strict rules in that context. And we would like to see that most measures when it comes to taxes and fees do not only apply to the EU countries, but also at an international level. So we may be positive, take a positive stand to this. Thank you. That brings us to the end of that round of rejoinders, and the next speaker is Tina Acketoft. You have the floor. Okay.
Tack så mycket, fru talman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Many have mentioned the challenges we face in Sweden and the EU and the possibilities that cooperation brings with it. And we talk about taking a leadership role, but still the Liberals want a European FBI to stop international crime, a European carbon dioxide tax to reduce emissions, a mechanism for the rule of law that automatically links aid to respecting the rule of law, a single market for digital services in the EU. And the Liberal Party wants competitive edge created by ensuring that women can have equal working conditions as men. We want an EU with solidarity. On some issues, we have now joined forces with some other parties, which is very good. And we've have many more tangible proposals for improving EU in the future, and we want to continue these discussions because we need to work together to reach our objectives, not to just come up with pretty words. We need to build alliances with those who are like-minded. We want a closer communication with the European Parliament. We want to mold opinion in favor of our causes in Europe. We need to be proactive. I very much support the idea that the EU can actually become better than the sum of its member states. And that's why we are now tackling the task of moulding the union. We disagree with the Left Party. We don't think we achieve better results by being critical. We think the best results are achieved by working together proactively to improve Sweden and to improve the EU. Thank you very much. The floor is passed to Amanda Palmstierna from the Environmental Party now to give an address. Please take the floor.
Fru talman.
Madam Speaker, I want to talk about EU trade policies. We have many parties here who advocate free trade quite eagerly. And it is very important that the single market and EU trade policies have to be reformed to be in line with the Paris Agreement and to also respect human rights. And here we have things that we can improve on. And the Commission has now introduced several progressive proposals in this field, and they assume a responsibility for green and human direction. Something that I mentioned before in the round of rejoinders is about the climate levies to ensure that goods imported from, for example, China has to pay the same costs for emissions as European countries. So it shouldn't be possible to gain a competitive edge by sabotaging the climate. If you do the least for the climate, you shouldn't gain an advantage because of that. We need to level the playing field here. The second Commission proposal I want to mention is what I mentioned before, the due diligence legislation, which means that the Commission wants it to be put into law that we should comply with the UN principles on human rights and to consider the environment throughout their entire chain of suppliers. The reason that the Commission has introduced this proposal is that in some places still now we see child labour, deforestation, displacement of indigenous groups and wages that you cannot live on. And this has all become worse because of the pandemic we are in. Unfortunately, a majority of European enterprises are positive to this law, and many Swedish companies also support it, and there's an active campaign from the civilian community, and therefore I want to really mention this. It's important that Sweden pushes for climate levies and a clearer focus on human rights and the environment. Sweden is needed in the EU and the EU is needed in the world. Thank you. We have rejoinders from Ms. Rosvall, Ilona Valdez and Desiree Petrus. First, we have Jessica Rosvall from the Moderate Party for a rejoinder. Please take the floor. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to get back to the climate crisis, which is one of our biggest problems, one out of several, unfortunately. Unfortunately, we have a government who have not had policies that are good enough for the climate. We haven't reduced our emissions as much as they need to reduce. We raised our objectives, and that's good. But to go back to what Ms. Waldau said, in this room, it's been clear that the Swedish government has not had clarity on this. Neither have they had clarity on social issues, to put it mildly. But all of you have heard comments about this, such as confusing two separate lines in parallel. So let me ask you, Ms. Palmstierna, are you in favour of the government's line on this that stands to reduce it by 55%, 60%? Or 70%. What is your position? Ms. Palmstierna, the Green Party. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Ms. Rosvall, for asking this question. Let me tell you that we have not been unclear. We've always said at least 55, aiming for 60%. And this has also been voiced by the EU Parliament, that it has to work in tandem with the development of science on this. We really need to raise our level of ambition here, and when the members of the alliance in the Swedish Parliament talk about it being confusing and playing bingo with numbers, that's something that is just something disreputable for politicians. So, of course, we've always said at least 55%, but preferably 60%. Ms. Rosvall. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, here, the government and the Left Party do agree. It's these unclear messages that have contributed to the confusion in this area. Now we have an agreement. Sorry? I don't think my mic... Sorry, there was a technical issue. Okay, thank you. So, the European Council did agree on 55%. That's the goal. That's good. It's a better goal than we had. The problem we have with the government is that they don't understand that, for example, Poland, if they've agreed to the 55% and they are going through a transition, that's about nuclear power. And I also want to mention to you, Ms. Palmstierna, as you mentioned in your address, if we are going to go away from depending on coal power, the nuclear power has to be part of the equation. So let me ask the Green Party if they think that nuclear power can help us transition in favour for the climate. Okay, response from Ms. Palmstierna. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Ms. Rosvall, for asking the question. When it comes to nuclear power, let me just say it's just fascinating to see the amount of energy the Moderate Party has invested in this on an EU level. I understand that this is something they want to discuss on a national level, but on the EU level, it's more of a fringe issue. It's more about technology neutrality that we should have, and the domestic competence is what we have on this matter. So for the Moderate Party to raise this, which is a home affairs issue in an EU debate, no, we don't think nuclear power is required on an international arena. Thank you very much. The next rejoinder is from Ms. Waldau from the Left Party. Please take the floor.
Fru talman.
Madam Speaker, Sweden will apply for funds from the Recovery Fund. About 30% will be earmarked for the environment, even more if you count other funds as well. I want to know if Sweden will earmark funds for green projects, or if they're going to use already budgeted funds, because that's what the Prime Minister talked about in the EU committee before. And we'd also like to know how the government parties will make sure that we can reach the green targets after the corona pandemic, and that we can become more resilient and more robust when faced with new challenges. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Ilona Satsmari-Waldau, for your question. It's not 30%, it's 37%, which will be earmarked of these funds. And of course, this money will be used to reduce the emissions into the atmosphere. So there will be different projects, different investments, and Sweden has a long history of working with innovations and being in the forefront of this development, such as hybrid, for instance, which when we have steel without coal, for instance, we will continue working with this and to have a green recovery after Corona. Of course, it's very important. Thank you, then Ilona Satsmari-Waldau. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Amanda Palmstierna, for your reply. That is right, it's 37%. I am quite satisfied with your reply, but I'm also concerned that this image perhaps is not shared by the government, because I would also like to say that the finance minister, in the recent EU committee meeting, she only talked about setting funds for the commitments we have already done on the extra budget and so on. We haven't so far seen anything that will be earmarked for the climate. And for the Left Party, of course, this is very important, that we use this crisis to become more eco-friendly and green. And I share this view with Amanda. I just want to know if I share this view with the government. Thank you. And then the final rejoinder from Amanda Palmstierna, the Green Party. Yes, it's my... I think that we have this Just Transition Fund. This will not only be given to other countries, but also to Sweden, and they have made decisions. But since it took a while until the budget was finalized, these funds have not been, we haven't received them yet. And we are now discussing with different counties and regions in Sweden. And regions have also talked to the government, and they've talked about they want to change industries and reduce emissions. We also have this climate tracking that the Green Party has been talking about during this entire EU debate, that we really have to be able to track the money and to make sure that we can prove that the funds actually go to green projects and investments. And this is something that we're quite happy with, and to make sure that we have a greener, more climate-friendly EU policy. Thank you. That was the round of that rejoinder. And now the next rejoinder is for Desiree Petrus from the Christian Democrats. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, the question about taxonomy and sustainable investments is something that we have discussed in the committee a few times. And the Commission's proposal is a threat to Swedish nuclear power and also water power, which is not seen as a sustainable investment. What do you think from the Green Party that Swedish water power is not included in this? Thank you, Amanda Palmstierna. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just have to say, I'm not really familiar with all the details, but I will try to answer this question. I can say that we support the purpose of taxonomy and to transform society and make it more sustainable. But taxonomy has flaws, and the Prime Minister has talked about this in various meetings with ministers. And now a reply has been remitted to the European Commission. I think you can also find it on the government's website. Of course, the idea is to create a more sustainability with taxonomy and not the opposite. And the government has asked various and multiple organizations and actors to, and we have been very active in this issue. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, let's hope that the government is trying to drive this issue and try to keep our Swedish energy supply, and that we can solve this question. I also hope that the Green Party also can agree that this should be included in the concept of taxonomy. We have another question that we've been talking about, the Moderate Party and the Green Party. We have human rights in different companies. And we had a question about this in the Employment Committee, about that we're also going to look into the charter for the companies, and the government is for due diligence, but not for controlling the companies. But that's usually the reply also from the companies on the EU level. So what do you think, the Green Party, what do you think that we will see a division here in these two issues from the government side? So final rejoinder here. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd just like to say that it's good to keep these two issues apart. We haven't really analyzed what the change of the charters of corporations would entail. So I think it's very important that we continue with due diligence now. And then the other question, we really need to analyze it more thoroughly. This is quite different from what it's... the situation in Sweden is quite different, but I think we should continue with due diligence, and then we also need to analyze the other issue more. Thank you very much. Then this was the end of the rejoinders. And also the EU debate is finished.
Jag anmäler om kompletteringsval. Ludvig Aspling, Sverigedemokraterna, som suppleant i utrikesutskottet. Jag förklarar honom vald. Punkt 2 och 3. Vi hade en till där. Mats Nordberg, Sverigedemokraterna, som suppleant i miljö- och jordbruksutskottet. Jag förklarar honom vald. Punkt 4 till 8. Anmälan om fördröjda svar på interpellationer. Jag anmäler att svar fördröjs på interpellationer enligt föredragningslistan. Punkt 9 till 13. Ärenden för hänvisning till utskott. Propositioner och motioner hänvisas till utskott enligt förslag på föredragningslistan. Punkt 32 till 35. Ärenden för debatt och avgöranden. Och här börjar vi då med utrikesutskottets betänkande 7, yttrandefrihet. Och ordet går till Marcus Wiesel, Sverigedemokraterna, för anförande. Varsågod.
Tack, fru talman. Idag debatterar vi som bekant utrikesutskottets betänkande om yttrandefrihet, en ytterst angelägen fråga så här i coronatider. Vi ser hur allt fler länder har valt att på olika sätt stänga ner sina verksamheter. Vi har sett befogade nedstängningar i syfte att rädda liv och hälsa, men vi har också sett obefogade, främst i totalitära stater som har sett sin möjlighet att ytterligare begränsa människors